Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the perilous world of feudal Japan, a world where your every move could mean life or death, and honor was the only currency that mattered. Imagine waking up in a society where every action, every word, and even your presence could be scrutinized by powerful, unyielding eyes. Now, imagine being in a time when samurai weren't just warriors, they were the backbone of society, and their sword was not just an instrument of war, but a symbol of absolute power. You're a mere peasant or low-ranking noble, and right off the bat, you're starting to realize survival is no guarantee. You probably won't last a day here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to hear where you're listening from. Post your location and local time. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the samurai, the warriors who were both revered and feared in feudal Japan. The samurai followed a strict code of honor known as bushido, which demanded complete obedience, respect, and a deep sense of duty. These men were expected to be living embodiments of honor, and any deviation from that code was treated with brutal consequences. Think you could survive the kind of pressure they were under? Think again. One slip-up, whether it was dishonoring your lord, showing weakness in battle, or betraying your own principles, and the result was death, usually by your own hand. In this world, honor was so tightly woven into the fabric of daily life that it often took precedence over basic survival. Now, let's be real. In this society, a samurai's life was as structured as it gets, and those who fell short were doomed. The tension in the air would make you feel like you were walking on eggshells. One wrong word could lead to your undoing. Whether it was a bad decision in battle, a poor display of loyalty, or an inappropriate glance toward a noble woman, one small mistake could turn your world upside down. So, imagine walking through life with that kind of weight hanging over your head every second of the day. It wasn't just about being tough, it was about being perfect. Can you imagine the pressure? It's a miracle anyone survived. So, you're in feudal Japan, and you're getting a feel for just how intense it is to survive here. But let's be clear about one thing. It wasn't just the samurai who had a brutal time. If you were a commoner, things were even worse. Sure, samurai had their strict codes and high expectations, but at least they had power. You, on the other hand, were likely a peasant, working the fields, always on edge, always looking over your shoulder. And if you were lucky enough to be granted a brief moment of favor, you still lived under the constant threat of a samurai's blade or a feudal lord's wrath. That's not even the worst part. The real kicker? You might not even get to choose when you die. In feudal Japan, punishments weren't just for show. If you offended the wrong person, or worse, a samurai, your death was often swift, public, and painfully final. For minor offenses, you could be punished in ways that seem unimaginable today. Being hacked to death with a katana, impaled in public, or tortured until you begged for mercy, which, of course, never came. A samurai's sword wasn't just a weapon, it was the instrument of justice in this world. And if you were unlucky enough to stand in the wrong place, it could quickly become your death sentence. That's right. All it took was a wrong look, a wrong word, and your life could be snuffed out like a candle in a windstorm. Historians still argue whether the extent of these punishments was truly necessary for maintaining order, or whether it was an abuse of power. Some suggest that this brutality was essential to upholding the samurai code of honor, while others argue it was simply a way to keep the common folk in line, reinforcing a system that kept the samurai in power while crushing any hint of rebellion. But either way, there's no question about it. You weren't going to survive long if you didn't know your place. And in a world where your life was measured by how well you fit into the rigid class structure, making the wrong move wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. At the very bottom of this system, the women. Let's take a moment to talk about what it was like for a woman in feudal Japan. If you were born a woman in this time, your life was predetermined. From a young age, you were taught to be submissive, obedient, and silent. The notion of family honor wasn't just something the samurai lived by. It was something you were expected to uphold too. You'd spend your life either under the thumb of your father or your husband, with little to no freedom of your own. Your role was simple: marry, bear children, and serve the household. To be a woman in feudal Japan was to be little more than an object, a means to continue a family line, a vessel for the next generation. That's it. Your existence was shaped by your relationships to the men in your life, and any attempt to break free from that mold would be met with harsh consequences. Imagine being a woman trapped in this world, always expected to be silent, always expected to obey, and constantly under threat. As a woman, you didn't get to fight back, and even if you tried, your only weapon was your wits. And good luck using that when your world was so tightly controlled. So, while the samurai were out there battling each other for honor and power, you, the woman, would be stuck at home, making sure the house ran smoothly, all while carrying the weight of expectations on your shoulders. Surviving was just a matter of keeping your head down and hoping you didn't make the wrong move. Now, let's move from the confines of the home to the expansive and unforgiving world of the feudal lord's domain. Imagine this. You're a peasant, working the fields day in and day out, in the same place where you were born, and probably the same place where you'll die. You're at the mercy of your lord, a man who likely views you as little more than a cog in his vast machinery. This land, and everything on it, belongs to him, and you are simply there to toil for it. If you think you have any rights, think again. The life of a peasant in feudal Japan was brutal and unyielding. You worked from sunrise to sunset, harvesting crops, tending to livestock, and maintaining the estate. And for what? A handful of rice and a roof over your head. Maybe, but if there was a bad harvest, if the rain didn't fall at the right time, or if you made the slightest mistake, well, the punishment could be swift and severe. Your lord had the power to take what little you had. And if you failed to meet expectations, your land could be confiscated, or worse, you could be forced into servitude. And if that wasn't enough, you were constantly under the threat of bandits, rebels, or natural disasters, each of which could wipe out your entire livelihood in an instant. Historians still debate how much autonomy peasants had under the feudal system. Some suggest that they had certain rights, such as being able to leave their land if things became unbearable. But in reality, most peasants were bound to the land, literally. If you tried to leave or run away, you'd be branded a criminal, and your punishment would be severe. Many peasants were so deeply entrenched in the system that escape wasn't even an option. They were part of a permanent, unchanging structure, with no way out. Even in death, the feudal system could claim you. Land wasn't just owned during your life, but your family was expected to carry on your work for generations. You were trapped in a cycle that never ended. But it wasn't just about survival for peasants. It was about the constant fear of what could go wrong. Even something as simple as a bad crop could send your entire life into turmoil. In a world where every decision, every move, was dictated by your lord, you were a mere pawn in a larger game. And the thing about playing a game where you have no control, it's a lot more dangerous than it seems. You could do everything right and still lose everything. Your life was entirely at the mercy of a feudal system that didn't care whether you lived or died, just as long as you paid your taxes, worked your land, and remained subservient. Meanwhile, the samurai and their aristocratic counterparts lived a life that, while harsh in its own way, was a world away from the peasants' struggles. They were warriors, trained in combat from a young age, taught the ways of honor and duty. But there was one thing that set them apart from the common folk: their relationship with death. For the samurai, death wasn't just a finality. It was a constant companion. Every day could be their last, whether in battle or at the hand of a superior. And because of that, they had to live with a level of intensity and honor that most people could never fathom. You, however, wouldn't be living in that world. You'd be toiling away, feeling the weight of the system bearing down on you at every turn, always at the mercy of those above you. There was no way to rise above it, unless, of course, you were lucky enough to be born into a family with some level of influence. But even then, your life would be precarious. Everything was precarious. Your survival depended not just on the whims of nature, but on the fickle decisions of the men and women in power. And, as we've seen time and again, those who failed to meet expectations didn't just lose their land, they lost their lives. Can you imagine it? Being trapped in a world where the smallest mistake could bring ruin. Where every day, every moment, felt like a constant balancing act between staying alive and tipping over into disaster. A bad season, a misstep, a harsh lord, and that could be the end of you. Let's now talk about the really dangerous part of feudal Japan, the feudal lords themselves. Picture this. You've been born into a society where power is everything. And I mean everything. If you were lucky enough to be born into a noble family, you'd have a life of luxury and leisure. Yes, but you'd also be entangled in a world where your survival depended not on your strength or cunning, but on your ability to navigate an unrelenting web of political alliances and enemies. Every feudal lord had his eyes on his rivals, always plotting, always scheming. It wasn't enough to just have power. You had to keep it. And keeping it often meant betraying someone. So, you've spent your life under the rule of a lord who decides not just your fate, but the fate of your family, your village, your entire future. If the lord was benevolent, if you were lucky, you might live in relative peace, working the land, paying taxes, and simply existing. But if he was cruel or if his power was threatened in any way, forget it. Everything you've known could change in an instant. And don't think that just because you're working for him, he won't dispose of you in a heartbeat if he feels threatened. Historians still debate the exact balance of power between the lords and their subjects. Some argue that the lords' control over their lands was absolute, and others suggest that there were moments when peasants could push back or find ways to avoid their lord's grasp. However, one thing is clear: the lord, whether benevolent or harsh, held your life in his hands. If you failed him, or worse, if you were perceived as a threat, you wouldn't just lose your land, you'd lose your life. So imagine living in constant fear, not of the battlefield, not of starvation, but of a lord who could take everything from you with a single order. A cruel lord didn't need a reason. He could decide your fate for something as simple as a failed crop or a minor disrespect. Your entire family could be exiled, or worse, executed. And if you didn't toe the line, the most extreme punishment was always on the table. The more power a lord held, the more ruthless he could be in keeping it. And if you crossed him, it could be curtains for you. No questions asked. The flip side of this coin is that, should you be a favorite of your lord, you might find yourself with immense power over others. You could rise from nothing and enjoy luxuries that few others would see, living in relative comfort. But remember, the moment you are no longer useful, or worse, the moment someone else caught the lord's eye, your rise to the top could just as quickly turn into a plummet back to the bottom. Let's take a minute and imagine the kind of power and danger these lords wielded. Not only were they the physical manifestation of the emperor's rule in their domain, but they also controlled the military. They commanded entire armies and could raise armies at will. If your lord went to war, you were expected to fight. Failure to comply could end in execution or public disgrace. Your life, your very survival, was directly tied to the whims of men who valued their ambition above anything else. And those ambitions, they weren't limited to military conquests. They often extended to family rivalries, political maneuvering, and even scheming with other lords or samurai to expand their reach. In this world, there was no guarantee of loyalty, only a fragile understanding that your survival was linked to maintaining the favor of the lord or the balance of power. One misstep in a political play, and suddenly, you were the target of a vendetta. Those who dared challenge the lord were swiftly dealt with, and the consequences were gruesome. Think about the pressure. Imagine the political maneuvering you'd have to navigate every day. You couldn't afford to be too bold, but you couldn't afford to be weak either. You'd need to read people like a book, predict their moves, and always be prepared to shift alliances at the slightest provocation. One wrong move, and you're out. Maybe you're even dead. The lord's power over your life was absolute. Historians argue whether this constant flux of power and allegiance made the system weaker or stronger. On one hand, it kept everyone in line, ensuring that anyone who rose to power had to work hard and be cunning. On the other hand, it created a volatile environment where alliances were fragile, and any shift in power could lead to chaos. As a commoner or a lesser lord, your existence was defined by this ever-shifting political landscape. You had no control over your own fate. The only thing you could rely on was survival instinct. So, how do you survive in a world where power and loyalty are so fleeting? It's simple. You bend and twist with the winds of fortune, but you do it quietly. Power is best wielded from the shadows, out of the spotlight. And if you can't be in the light, you get close enough to make things happen anyway. Stay one step ahead of the game, and hopefully, you'll stay alive long enough to see another day. But the reality is that no matter how carefully you tread, you'd always be at risk in this ever-shifting world of feudal Japan. Let's move on to something a bit darker, because in feudal Japan, things could get pretty gruesome if you weren't careful. This wasn't just a world of rigid class systems and political games. It was a world where betrayal, assassination, and bloody revenge were part of daily life. The art of violence wasn't just something for the battlefield. It was a tool used by samurai, lords, and even ordinary people to navigate the complex web of power. And for someone like you, a lowly peasant or unimportant noble, this meant your life was never guaranteed. One wrong step, one bad interaction, and you might find yourself staring down the barrel of death. Let's talk about seppuku, ritual suicide. It was a practice reserved for samurai, and it was used to restore honor, whether through personal disgrace or failure to live up to expectations. If a samurai disgraced himself, he didn't beg for forgiveness. He performed seppuku to cleanse his honor. But here's the kicker. As a commoner or lesser noble, you didn't get the luxury of such a dignified end. If you failed, you were punished. And the punishments were brutal. Whether it was dismemberment, beheading, or being left to starve, the outcome was always grim. Historians still debate the role of seppuku in Japanese culture. Some argue it was a noble act, one that served to remind people of the importance of honor in the samurai's world. Others suggest that it was more of a political tool, a way for those in power to exert control over their samurai and instill fear. Either way, it wasn't something you wanted to experience firsthand. It wasn't just the samurai who lived with this looming threat of death. If you were a servant or a lower-class individual, you'd likely be dragged into the chaos of the political bloodshed. But it wasn't just the fear of violence that you had to contend with. It was also the constant sense of mistrust and paranoia. The more power you gained, the more enemies you created. If you weren't careful, you could easily find yourself at odds with someone who had the means and the will to end you. And those who had the most to lose were often the quickest to strike first. The political maneuvering in the imperial court wasn't just about making allies. It was about keeping your back covered, knowing that at any moment, someone might try to kill you to get ahead. Imagine the atmosphere, thick with tension, everyone watching their every word and move, all while keeping a dagger close to hand. This wasn't a world where you could afford to make mistakes. You had to be constantly aware of who was watching, who was plotting, and who might be ready to betray you at the slightest provocation. Imagine living every day under that kind of pressure, knowing that the line between survival and death was razor thin. It's not just about physical violence either. The samurai were masters of psychological warfare, using their intelligence and guile as much as their swords. In a court full of intrigue, it wasn't enough to be just tough. You had to be smart, calculating, and able to manipulate people without them even realizing it. A wrong word to the wrong person, a rumor spread at the right time, and suddenly, you've sealed your fate. You could be cast out of favor, turned into a political pawn, or even eliminated outright. This level of ruthlessness was so ingrained in the culture that even children were taught from a young age that honor, loyalty, and power were the only things that mattered. The concept of survival in such a world wasn't just about staying alive. It was about maintaining your place at the top. And for that, you had to be prepared to eliminate anyone who stood in your way. Loyalty was everything, but it was also precariously fragile. At any moment, someone might turn on you. And when they did, there was no coming back. Historians still argue about the influence of samurai culture on the wider Japanese society. Was it just a brutal outgrowth of the feudal system? Or was it something more? An integral part of Japan's identity that valued strength and honor above all else? Some scholars claim the samurai were the true rulers of Japan, wielding power behind the scenes while the emperors were reduced to symbolic figures. Others believe the system itself was inherently unstable, where only the strong could survive, and even they were eventually consumed by the same brutality they'd wielded to climb to the top. No matter the interpretation, the fact remains that this was a world where violence was woven into the fabric of everyday life, and surviving it required more than just physical strength. You had to be prepared to kill or be killed, to betray or be betrayed. And if you weren't ruthless enough, or if you failed to keep up with the constant power shifts, you would find yourself discarded without hesitation. The game wasn't about playing fair, it was about surviving, no matter what it took. In a world where every samurai's sword could end your life, could you make it to the end of the day without being cut down by the people around you? But it wasn't just the fear of sudden death or betrayal that made life so treacherous in feudal Japan. It was also the crushing weight of societal expectations. The samurai and their rigid code of conduct, Bushido, demanded nothing less than perfection. For every warrior and every member of the court, honor was the highest value, more important than food, shelter, or even life itself. This wasn't just a philosophy, it was a way of life, one that governed every action, every word, and every decision. And if you failed, if you didn't live up to those ideals, the consequences could be catastrophic. So, let's say you're a samurai. You're not just a warrior. You're expected to embody the ideals of Bushido: loyalty, courage, compassion, honesty, and, above all, honor. If you falter, if you fail to meet those expectations, you not only disgrace yourself, but also your entire family. To die with dishonor was considered worse than death itself, and the only way to restore that honor was through seppuku, ritual suicide. But here's the thing. It wasn't just about making a bad decision in battle. Even minor mistakes, such as misjudging the tone of a conversation or failing to offer the proper respect to a superior, could be grounds for this ultimate act of self-purification. So imagine living with that kind of pressure, knowing that one wrong move could mean the end, not just of your life, but of your family's reputation. But what if you're not a samurai? What if you're just an ordinary person, trying to survive in a world where these ideals are enforced by death itself? You're a peasant or a merchant, just trying to make a living, but your survival is still tied to the whims of the samurai. You may never wield a sword, but you're living in the shadow of those who do. Imagine being completely powerless, forced to live by rules you can't control, watching as the lives of those around you are decided by things you can't even comprehend. To survive, you'd have to be as invisible as possible, blending in with the crowd, never standing out, never drawing attention. You'd be expected to obey without question, work without complaint, and accept your place in the world without protest. You don't get to question the system because, in this world, questioning it could cost you everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the system wasn't just about survival, it was about competition. It wasn't enough to simply live, to be truly safe. You had to climb, you had to rise above those around you. This wasn't just a world of survival, it was a world where you were constantly vying for a better position, competing for your place in society. If you weren't careful, you could easily be swept aside, forgotten, or worse, discarded. You couldn't afford to show weakness, to appear vulnerable. There was no mercy for those who fell behind or were seen as irrelevant. Historians still argue whether this rigid class system was truly necessary to maintain the peace, or if it just perpetuated inequality and suffering. Some suggest that it was the foundation of stability in a constantly changing world, while others point out that it created an environment of immense cruelty, where survival was a privilege only for the strongest. What we do know is that this system bred an intense level of competition and rivalry, where people were not only fighting to survive, but fighting to avoid being cast out of the social order. And in a world where the smallest misstep could cost you everything, it's no wonder that trust was in short supply. Betrayal was commonplace, and loyalty was something to be bought and sold, sometimes with the samurai's sword. As a peasant, surviving wasn't just about hard work. It was about being clever, being strategic, and knowing when to keep your head down and when to rise up. You had to play the game even if the rules were rigged against you. And if you were lucky, you'd have a chance to better your situation. But for most, it was just a game of staying alive, of avoiding the attention of those who could make you disappear with a single word. What you didn't know, however, was that sometimes survival meant more than just avoiding death. It meant playing into the larger narrative of power, manipulation, and control. Those who could navigate the court's political intrigue, understand the samurai's codes, and climb the social ladder would eventually hold power. The rest, well, they just had to stay out of the way. Because in a world of feudal Japan, being noticed for the wrong reasons meant being erased from the picture completely. Now, imagine that life for a moment. You're a peasant or an ordinary noble, not wealthy, not powerful. And yet, every day, your life is determined by those in power. You could be moved at the whim of a lord, crushed by the weight of expectations, or torn apart by the brutal competition that rages just beneath the surface of your world. This was the reality for most of the people living in feudal Japan. And if you didn't keep your wits about you, you'd quickly find yourself on the wrong end of that sword. At this point, you might be thinking, well, at least the samurai had a sense of purpose and honor in all this chaos. And yes, that's true. Being a samurai did come with its privileges, but it wasn't all glitz and glamour. The life of a samurai wasn't about fighting epic battles or living in luxury, as we often romanticize in movies. No, their lives were built around an unrelenting devotion to duty, the never-ending pursuit of honor, and a strict adherence to Bushido, their way of life. This code wasn't just something they followed during times of war. It was something they lived and breathed every single day. And while they may have wielded swords and enjoyed a certain status in society, their existence was often more about discipline and sacrifice than it was about personal glory. Now, let's talk about how this code of Bushido worked. Picture yourself as a samurai, and every move you make, every word you speak, is measured against a strict set of rules. Your duty to your lord, your family, and your honor come first, always. If you fail to uphold these values, you risk dishonoring yourself and those around you. And the ultimate price for that failure, seppuku, that's right, if you dishonored yourself, the only way to restore your honor was through death, by your own hand. And don't think that was reserved just for the truly disgraceful. Even minor lapses in loyalty or failure to meet the rigorous standards of Bushido could lead to this brutal form of self-purification. Imagine living in constant fear that any mistake, no matter how small, could lead to such an agonizing and final consequence. But here's the thing. Bushido wasn't just about keeping yourself in line. It was also about knowing your place in the larger scheme of things, and how much control you actually had over your life. Despite their perceived status, samurai were bound by an incredibly rigid social structure. They were not free to live as they pleased. They had to answer to their lords. And their loyalty to those lords was absolute. They couldn't just pick up and leave if things got tough. and they certainly couldn't challenge their lord's authority without facing severe repercussions. So, despite the martial prowess and social privileges, being a samurai came with its own kind of entrapment. Your life was not your own. It belonged to the ideals of Bushido, and to the whims of the powerful men who ruled over you. Historians still debate the extent to which Bushido shaped the lives of samurai in practical terms. Some believe that it was a genuine way of life, an ideal to which samurai strove to live up. Others argue that it was more of a political tool used by the ruling classes to control their warriors, ensuring that they adhered to a code that was largely about preserving the status quo. Either way, the pressure to live by such a strict code was immense, and to fail in any way meant death, not just for you, but possibly for your family as well. Your failure to live up to Bushido wasn't just personal, it was a stain on the reputation of your entire lineage. Now, let's imagine you're a samurai, forced to adhere to this code in every aspect of your life. You wake up each day knowing that you're expected to be perfect, physically fit, mentally sharp, and absolutely loyal to your lord. That means no room for personal desires, no space for self-pity, no excuse for failure. You train with your sword for hours on end. Practice meditation to maintain mental clarity, and study the classics to hone your wisdom. It sounds intense, right? And the burden of Bushido was not just about following rules, it was about embodying them so fully that you became them. You didn't get to relax or take breaks. You were always on guard, always watching, always ensuring you lived up to the legacy of your ancestors. But here's the trick. Even though these samurai lived by a code that demanded perfection, they were human. The constant pressure, the fear of failure, and the brutal consequences for any misstep could easily break anyone down. Imagine the strain of living in a world where one mistake could cost you everything. A wrong word, a slight misunderstanding, a moment of weakness, and suddenly, you're facing the ultimate punishment. Seppuku wasn't just a choice. It was a consequence that hung over every samurai's head, like a sword ready to drop at any moment. So, how does this apply to you? The lowly commoner or minor noble caught up in this web of ruthless power struggles? Well, it's simple. You wouldn't stand a chance in this system. The samurai may have been bound by honor, but they still had more power than you could ever imagine. As a commoner, you'd be caught between the samurai and their lords, always at risk of becoming collateral damage in their brutal games of power. Your life would be shaped by their whims, and if you weren't lucky enough to be born into a privileged family, you'd be a pawn in a game where the stakes were life and death. And it wasn't just the samurai who could end your life. As a peasant or a lower-class noble, your survival was determined by the power of others, by the decisions made by people who saw you as nothing more than a tool to maintain their own status. You'd never know when a samurai might decide to take offense at something you said or did, or when a feudal lord might take away everything you had just to assert his dominance. In a world of such stark hierarchy, where everyone had their place and their role, you could easily find yourself crushed by the weight of the system. Now, let's talk about the kind of life you'd face as a commoner, and why you'd be living on the edge every single day. As a peasant, your life was centered around survival, and survival alone. No one cared about your dreams or your aspirations. You were born into your station, and that's where you stayed, unless, of course, you were fortunate enough to escape through some unforeseen miracle. But escaping the grip of the feudal system wasn't something many could pull off. The system was rigid, unyielding, and your place in it was preordained. You worked from dawn to dusk, often on the land you could barely call your own, toiling in the fields, planting rice, harvesting crops, repairing tools. Everything you did was for the benefit of your lord, and you were compensated minimally. Your life was spent working for the samurai or the local nobleman. And in return, you got the privilege of staying alive, for now. If you were lucky, you had a small house to return to at the end of the day, a roof over your head, and food to eat. But, in truth, most peasants struggled to get by, scraping together a few meager possessions and just enough rice to survive. But let's not sugarcoat it. Survival wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about navigating a world that didn't care whether you lived or died. A bad harvest, a drought, a cold winter, any of these could send you into ruin. And that's not to mention the constant threat of bandits or wars between feudal lords, which could disrupt everything you had worked for. If there was a revolt, you were in danger. If your lord's lands were attacked, you could be wiped out along with his army. The fragile security you felt on a good day could vanish the next. And when that happened, there was no one to help you. You were on your own. And any hope of improvement seemed a distant dream. It wasn't just nature and warfare you had to worry about, though there were also taxes that you had to pay, no matter how poor you were. These weren't small amounts either. Your lord would take what little you had, leaving you with just enough to survive until the next harvest. And if you failed to meet the demands, well, there were punishments. Sometimes it was simple humiliation. Other times, it could be more severe, like confiscating your crops, or worse, forcing you and your family to become indentured servants to make up for the deficit. It didn't matter if you were sick or injured, your labor was demanded. It was a system designed to keep you in place and to remind you that your life wasn't your own. Historians still argue whether the feudal system was as exploitative as it sounds. Some suggest that it was necessary for maintaining order in a turbulent time, where war and famine were common. But others argue that it was an inherently cruel system that kept the rich in power while crushing the poor beneath their heels. Either way, you would have been caught in the crossfire. And even if you did your best to survive, your chances of climbing the social ladder were slim to none. You were more likely to be born, work, and die without ever leaving the station you were born into. Now, imagine what it would be like to be stuck in this system. Every day, you wake up knowing your day will be a struggle. Physically, mentally, and emotionally, you have no control over your future. Even if you did everything right, the system still has its own set of rules, and they don't bend for you. You could work yourself to exhaustion, only to find that the fruits of your labor were going to line the pockets of someone else. Every year, you'd live with the hope that the harvest would be better, that the Lord wouldn't raise your taxes, that a war wouldn't break out. But you never knew if you could count on any of it. The system didn't just restrict your physical freedom, it restricted your mental and emotional freedom as well. You had no space to question the world you lived in, no room for rebellion. Your role was set, and any deviation from it could bring swift retribution. If you were a peasant, the best you could do was stay invisible, keep your head down, and hope that the system didn't crush you under its weight. And if you happened to cross paths with a samurai, well, forget it. Their code of honor meant they could dispose of you on a whim, should you show disrespect or fail to honor their status. And let's not forget, those who were even slightly above you, the artisans, the merchants, the minor samurai, they all had a hand in keeping the system going. Your life, in their eyes, was a resource. And if you failed, if you struggled too much, there was no safety net to catch you. The social hierarchy was a pyramid, with you at the bottom, and there was no real way to escape it. The fear of death wasn't just about violence, it was about being discarded, forgotten, and left to rot. Historians still argue whether the rigid feudal system was necessary to maintain order, or if it simply perpetuated inequality and stifled creativity. Some believe that the system created stability by keeping the social classes in check, while others claim it kept the lower classes suppressed and dependent. But for you, as a peasant or minor noble, one thing is clear. Your survival depended on your ability to stay in line. Anything else? Any attempt to rise above your station was a death sentence in itself. As we continue this journey through feudal Japan, let's talk about the real foundation of power in this system. The military. It wasn't just the samurai who held power, it was the armies, the mercenaries, the strategists, and the spies. The military was not just a tool for expansion, it was the key to survival. If you weren't in control of an army, you weren't in control of anything. Imagine it. Every single day, the samurai were preparing for battle, sharpening their swords, training in the art of war, and making strategic alliances, all to ensure that their families, their lands, and their power remained intact. But here's the kicker. War wasn't just about fighting battles, it was about maintaining control. Sure, the samurai were expert fighters, but their true power lay in their ability to manipulate the political landscape and use force as a last resort. Diplomacy, alliances, and psychological warfare were just as important as physical combat. In this world, the samurai didn't just live by the sword, they lived by strategy. Every single move had to be calculated. One wrong move, one failed alliance, and you could find yourself surrounded by enemies, with no way out. For the peasants or lower-class nobles, the reality of the military was simple. You didn't have control. You were at the mercy of the samurai, the feudal lords, and their military might. If war broke out, your entire life could be turned upside down. You'd have no say in the matter. You'd either be forced to fight, be caught in the crossfire, or worse, be caught by bandits, criminals, or enemy forces. The peasants were seen as expendable, just bodies to be used when the need for labor arose. If your lord needed you to work on the battlefield, that's what you would do, whether you wanted to or not. You had no power to resist. This constant looming threat of violence is what made life so precarious. You could be at peace one moment, only to be thrown into the chaos of war the next. And let's not forget, the military wasn't just about defending against external threats. Civil wars, rebellions, and internal conflicts were just as common. The feudal lords were constantly vying for control over the lands. And this meant that even within the relatively quiet confines of your village, the fear of violence never truly left. If your lord's enemy came marching through your town, your life would be disrupted in ways you couldn't even imagine. And, should the worst happen, you would be completely defenseless. And don't think the soldiers were the only ones who held power. The strategists, the generals, and even the spies played a critical role in maintaining the status quo. The world of feudal Japan wasn't just about fighting with swords, it was about controlling information, managing perceptions, and manipulating the narrative. A skilled strategist could turn the tide of a battle without even drawing a blade. Your survival in this world wasn't just about being physically strong. It was about understanding the complex dance of alliances, betrayals, and power plays. Imagine for a moment being caught in this web. You're just a peasant or a low-ranking noble, trying to survive the best you can, when suddenly war breaks out. You watch as samurai and soldiers march through your town, and you're left with no choice but to either comply or face dire consequences. The fate of your entire family could hinge on whether or not your lord's forces win the battle. This wasn't just a system of survival, it was a constant reminder that the very power you had was fleeting. A single misstep could lead to your destruction. You weren't just surviving the elements, you were surviving a system where power was always in flux, always shifting, and always out of your reach. This level of instability wasn't just terrifying, it was exhausting. Every moment, you would be forced to live under the constant threat of war, political upheaval, and violence. The idea of living in peace was almost laughable in this environment. Sure, there were brief moments of respite, but for the most part, life was a never-ending struggle to stay one step ahead of the forces that could easily wipe you out. Historians still debate whether this constant state of readiness and fear contributed to the samurai's ultimate downfall. Some argue that it made them resilient, able to withstand the challenges that came their way. Others claim that it made them fragile, constantly in danger of overreaching or making mistakes in the pursuit of power. Either way, what's clear is that the military was central to the survival of this society, and for those caught in its wake. There was no escaping its power. Now, let's take a moment to talk about the psychological toll of living in this world. If you were a samurai, constantly sharpening your skills, never knowing when the next battle would come or whether your lord would turn on you, the mental strain was almost as great as the physical. And if you were a peasant, watching this constant power struggle from the sidelines, always aware that your survival depended on the whims of those in charge, the stress would eat away at you. You'd never be able to relax, never able to feel truly safe. In feudal Japan, peace was temporary, and security was an illusion. One misstep, and your world would come crashing down. The samurai, the lords, and even the peasants were all bound by the same harsh reality. Survival was a privilege, not a right. Let's talk about the seasons in feudal Japan. Because in a world as unpredictable and harsh as this, nature could either be your ally or your enemy. While we often romanticize the changing seasons, especially in a place as beautiful as Japan, the reality for the common people was much grimmer. Winter, spring, summer, and autumn didn't just mark the passage of time, they determined whether you lived or died. Each season came with its own set of challenges, and depending on your social class, your survival was far from guaranteed. Imagine it's winter. The snow has fallen, the winds are biting, and the cold cuts through every layer of clothing you have. You're a peasant, and your survival depends on being able to harvest enough food to last through the long, brutal months. But it's not just the cold you need to worry about, it's the scarcity of food. The rice harvest wasn't always dependable, and if you failed to store enough food, you risk starvation. What little grain you did have was often hoarded by the samurai or the local lords, who were always more concerned with their own comfort and luxury than the well-being of the people who worked their land. You could go days without eating, and if the lord's soldiers came to collect taxes, you'd be forced to hand over what little food you had left, even if it meant your family would go hungry. Historians still argue whether winter hardships were truly as severe as they've been portrayed. Some suggest that the peasants were used to these conditions and had developed methods to cope with the harshness of the season, while others point out that the survival rates were significantly affected by the constant threat of hunger, disease, and freezing temperatures. What we do know for certain is that winters were far from forgiving, and survival often came down to whether or not the weather was on your side. Spring, on the other hand, could be a time of hope or disaster. If you had a decent crop, the fresh growth of rice and other crops could mean a better year. But if there was a late frost or an early flood, it could ruin everything. As a peasant, your entire year hinged on how well your crops grew. In this world, your ability to survive wasn't just about your work ethic. It was about whether the weather gods favored you, and even then, the same risks applied year after year, without a break in sight. It's a terrifying thought. A year's worth of hard work could be wiped out by something as uncontrollable as weather. If your harvest failed, there was no mercy from your Lord. You simply couldn't afford to live without that food. Summer could be just as unforgiving. The heat, the humidity, and the long hours in the fields made it a grueling season. You were expected to work without rest, often from sunrise to sunset. While the samurai were training in their art of war, you were laboring under the punishing sun, with no relief. There were no cool breaks, no comfortable places to sit. You were always exposed, always working, always watching the sky for signs of drought or storms. If the rains didn't come, your crops would wither, and you would go hungry again. And if a battle or rebellion broke out, you could find yourself dragged into it, forced to fight or watch as your village was ransacked. But autumn was perhaps the cruelest of all. Harvest time meant the completion of a year's worth of work. And if you were a peasant, it also meant the final judgment. If your crops were bountiful, you could rest easy knowing you'd have enough food to survive the winter. But if your crops were meager, the Lord's soldiers would come to collect taxes, and you'd be left with nothing. And if a war broke out in the fall, you'd have no chance to recover. The weather might be kind, but your life was still at the mercy of the feudal system. The season of harvest wasn't a time for rest. It was a time of anxiety, a time of reckoning, where everything you worked for could be ripped away by forces beyond your control. The seasons were as unforgiving as the political system you were bound to, a constant reminder that in feudal Japan, nature was just as cruel as the people in power. There was no real escape from the cycle of hope and despair that each season brought with it. And no matter how hard you worked, you were always at the mercy of the forces around you, be it the weather, your lord, or the samurai who ruled over you. Survival wasn't just about working hard. It was about surviving the whims of nature, the politics of the court, and the constant looming threat of violence. You could never relax, never let your guard down, because in a world like this, everything could change in an instant. Historians still debate how much of feudal Japan's rural hardships were exacerbated by the demands of the samurai class. Was it the harshness of the seasons? Or was it the feudal system that kept the peasants shackled to the land, always struggling to survive? Some argue that the struggles of the common folk were a necessary part of maintaining the delicate balance of the feudal system, while others suggest that this imbalance was the very reason why the system eventually crumbled. Either way, what is clear is that for the peasants, life was a never-ending battle, not just against the elements, but against a system that kept them on the edge of survival. By now, you're probably wondering how anyone could survive in such an environment. A world where your survival was always on the line, where you could be wiped out by nature's whim or political intrigue. Well, if you were lucky enough to be born into the samurai class or granted some measure of privilege, you'd be living a very different life, but one filled with its own set of challenges. The samurai were not just warriors, they were the enforcers of the feudal system, the ones who maintained order and, let's be honest, their own power. But even though they had more privilege and protection than the commoners, their lives were anything but simple. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your entire life was defined by your sword. Your worth, your reputation, your very existence was determined by how well you wielded that blade, and not just in combat. The samurai were expected to be moral paragons, warriors who followed Bushido, a strict code of honor that demanded perfection. You could be an expert swordsman, trained in the art of war since childhood, but if you showed even the slightest weakness or dishonor, your entire identity would be at risk. The concept of saving face was everything, and the weight of maintaining that honor was unbearable at times. But even the most well-trained samurai couldn't escape the brutal reality of their existence. Their position in society, despite its prestige, was often precarious. In a world filled with constant political maneuvering, alliances shifted like sand. If you were a samurai, your life could be upended by the actions of your lord, the political situation of the time, or even the whims of the emperor. The samurai may have had power, but they had to constantly prove their worth and loyalty, and this could come at a heavy price. Samurai didn't just fight in battles, they also engaged in constant internal struggles. With the feudal system's emphasis on loyalty and hierarchy, a samurai's life was defined by their relationships with their lords and peers. You couldn't simply act for yourself. Every decision you made was filtered through the lens of your duty to your lord. And if you ever found yourself in a situation where your loyalty was questioned, your entire honor was at stake. Failure to live up to the expectations of Bushido often meant an end that could be just as brutal as the battlefield. Through seppuku, a ritual suicide meant to restore honor to your name. The idea that a warrior could be brought to this point just for failing to live by a code might seem extreme to us, but it was a reality that no samurai could escape. Historians still argue whether the samurai were truly warriors of virtue, or whether the rigid system of Bushido was simply a tool for the ruling class to maintain power. Some believe that Bushido was the foundation of the samurai's honor and purpose, creating a warrior class that could both protect the nation and enforce the law. Others argue that it was more of a self-serving construct, meant to maintain a societal order that was built on hierarchy and control. Either way, one thing is clear. The samurai lived by a set of rules that dictated every aspect of their lives, and failure to follow them was considered worse than death itself. But let's dig deeper. Even though samurai had their honor and their power, they still had to deal with the harsh realities of feudal life. Wars were constant. In a world where power was gained through military conquest, you couldn't afford to be weak. If your lord was involved in a battle, you were expected to fight, regardless of personal desire. You didn't get to sit out. You didn't get to choose your battles. You fought for your lord, for your land, for your survival. And let's not forget the toll that constant war and bloodshed took on the samurai themselves. Battle after battle, year after year. It wasn't just the wounds that accumulated. The psychological strain of living in a perpetual state of war could break even the strongest of minds. There were no breaks, no holidays from the relentless duty to fight, to protect, to be loyal. Imagine living this life every day. Your existence is defined by the blade you carry and the lord you serve. You're bound to your duty, constantly training, constantly sharpening your skills, always living in the shadow of honor, duty, and loyalty. Failure was not an option, and the pressure to perform at the highest level, both in battle and in society, was crushing. But even with all that pressure, there was no escape. Your honor was always on the line. Your survival was always tied to the whims of those above you. And if you failed, if you faltered, the punishment wasn't just social disgrace, it was death. The samurai lived in constant fear of dishonor, because dishonor meant the ultimate price, the destruction of your reputation, your family, your life. The samurai's obsession with honor wasn't just about personal pride. It was a reflection of the larger society's values. In feudal Japan, status was everything. Your entire existence was tied to the way others saw you. And the samurai, they were at the top of that hierarchy. But their lives were shaped by a system that demanded perfection. You couldn't afford to show weakness. You couldn't afford to fail. The life of a samurai was a constant balancing act between loyalty, personal integrity, and survival. And the smallest mistake could lead to your downfall. At this point, you're probably realizing just how dangerous life was in feudal Japan. Not just because of the constant threats from the military, the fear of political betrayal, or the merciless punishment for failure, but because of the almost suffocating rigidity of the social structure. It wasn't just the samurai who had to live within a set of unyielding rules. The entire society, from the emperor at the top to the peasants at the bottom, was caught in a web of hierarchy and expectation. The problem was, if you were born into the lower classes, you had no choice but to accept your fate. And if you weren't born into power, you had very little chance of changing your position. There was no room for upward mobility. And if you even thought about breaking free, you were considered a threat to the established order. Think about this. In a society so focused on class, you couldn't just decide to change your life. You couldn't simply pick up a sword and challenge your lord to a duel to prove your worth. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant until the day you died. There were no second chances. The social hierarchy was not just a reflection of power, it was a trap that kept people in place, ensuring that the wealthy and powerful remained at the top, and the poor stayed locked at the bottom. As a commoner, your entire life was shaped by the demands of the samurai and the feudal lords. You didn't have the luxury of taking a day off. Every action you took, every decision you made, was to benefit those above you. From dawn till dusk, you worked the fields, built infrastructure, or served the samurai in whatever way was required. And if there was war, you didn't get to choose if you wanted to fight. If your lord needed soldiers, you were one of them. Whether you were trained for battle or not, even the samurai, for all their power, were trapped in this system. Yes, they had status, wealth, and honor, but they were still bound by their lord's will. Your honor as a samurai didn't just belong to you, it was tied to your family, your lord, and even your village. If your lord called you to war, you went, no questions asked. And if your lord failed or fell, so did you. If your lord lost favor with the emperor, you might find yourself stripped of your lands, your title, and even your life. The samurai weren't as free as you might think. The system didn't just bind the peasants, it also bound them to a set of expectations that were as unforgiving as anything the common folk endured. This rigid social order was reinforced by the idea of shame. In feudal Japan, honor wasn't just personal, it was communal. Your actions reflected on your entire family. One mistake, one public failure, and your entire lineage would be dishonored. This is why seppuku, or ritual suicide, was seen as the ultimate way to atone for disgrace. To fail in battle, to fail your lord, to fail your family. It wasn't just an individual failure. It was a stain on your entire bloodline. Your children would carry that shame with them forever, and their children after them. There was no escaping it. Now, let's turn our attention to something you might not have considered yet: the power of the emperor. On the surface, the emperor was the highest authority in Japan, but in reality, the emperor was more of a symbolic figurehead than an actual ruler. The real power lay with the shogun, the military leader, who commanded the samurai and made decisions on behalf of the country. The emperor's role was largely ceremonial, a figurehead for the divine legitimacy of the ruling system. The shogun was the true ruler of Japan, and his power was absolute. So, while the emperor's image was revered and his position was considered sacred, the samurai and the shogun were the ones who actually held power. If you lived in this world, you'd find yourself at the mercy of both the emperor's divine mandate and the shogun's military might. The emperor's power came from the belief that he was the earthly representative of the gods, but in practice, he was often nothing more than a puppet, with the shogun pulling the strings behind the scenes. The irony here? You could spend your whole life in the emperor's court, living in luxury, but never have any real say in how things were done. The political structure was a carefully maintained illusion, and if you weren't careful, you might find yourself lost in the game. Historians still debate whether the emperor was a true ruler or just a figurehead in the feudal system. Some suggest that the emperor's role was critical in maintaining the legitimacy of the shogunate, while others argue that the emperor was little more than a pawn in a complex political game. Regardless of the emperor's true power, one thing is clear: if you weren't born into a noble or samurai family, you were at the mercy of both the emperor's divine authority and the shogun's military might. The system didn't care about you. It cared about preserving the power of those at the top, no matter who had to suffer in the process. Living in feudal Japan meant living in a world where your survival depended on the status you were born into, and the brutal reality of maintaining that status. Whether you were a samurai, a peasant, or a minor noble, your life was dictated by an unyielding system that left little room for personal ambition or change. It was a world where violence, betrayal, and political intrigue were everyday occurrences, and where the line between life and death was razor thin. To survive, you had to be cunning, strong, and unyielding, always prepared for the worst, always ready to play the game. By now, you're probably beginning to understand that survival in feudal Japan wasn't just about physical strength or tactical intelligence. It was also about your ability to navigate a complex web of social and political expectations. The samurai and their lords weren't just battling each other on the battlefield. They were also engaged in a far subtler form of warfare, where every word spoken, every gesture made, and every alliance formed could tip the scales of power. You couldn't afford to be naive in this world. If you were, you'd quickly find yourself a pawn in a game you couldn't control. But here's the thing: even if you were lucky enough to find a position of power, you were never safe. No one was ever truly safe in feudal Japan. Whether you were a samurai, a lord, or a peasant, your fate was always at the mercy of those more powerful than you. The system was built on fragile alliances, and even the strongest leaders could be toppled in the blink of an eye. The downfall of powerful lords and samurai often came not through force, but through whispers in the court, political maneuvering, and betrayal. One wrong word, one misplaced loyalty, and everything could come crashing down. The same applied to the political landscape in Japan. It wasn't enough to be a good fighter or a strong leader. You had to be an expert in the art of diplomacy, able to maintain alliances with the right people at the right time. Even the most powerful samurai and lords were constantly at risk of losing everything if their political games didn't play out in their favor. Alliances were formed, broken, and reformed with astonishing speed, as the slightest shift in power could tip the entire balance. Trust, in this world, was a commodity, and it was one that was incredibly hard to come by. Let's take a moment to reflect on the dangers of this constant political dance. If you were a samurai or a lord, you had to balance loyalty to your own lord with the shifting allegiances of the court. This meant that even the most minor transgression could cause a rift that would lead to your downfall. If your lord was losing power, you could quickly find yourself swept up in his failures, even if you had done nothing wrong. On the flip side, if you betrayed your lord to align with another, you could find yourself branded a traitor, ostracized, or worse, executed. Peasants, however, didn't have the luxury of playing these games. They were simply at the mercy of the political struggles of the elite. If you were a peasant, Your life wasn't shaped by political maneuvering, it was shaped by the whims of your lord, the seasons, and the inevitable consequences of war. You weren't involved in the decision-making. You weren't consulted when the wars broke out, or when a lord decided to raise taxes. You simply had to survive, endure the hardships, and hope for better days ahead. And when war came to your village, you could only watch as your life and home were upended by forces you couldn't control. But even though peasants had little say in the political game, they were still an integral part of it. The agricultural work done by peasants was what supported the samurai and the feudal lords. Without food, the entire system would collapse. And that's where things get even more complicated. If the samurai or their lords miscalculated, or if they made a strategic move that affected the peasants' livelihoods, you'd see revolts. These were the moments where the peasants, desperate and starving, could rise up against their rulers. But even these moments were fleeting. Any attempt to fight back was crushed quickly, with the full might of the samurai coming down on you. Historians still debate whether the feudal system truly had the potential to work for the common people. Some argue that the system created a semblance of stability, where everyone had a role to play. But others suggest that it was inherently flawed, with too many people at the top living in luxury and too many at the bottom living in squalor. One thing is clear. The system was designed to serve the samurai and the lords, and anyone who wasn't part of that elite class was, for the most part, expendable. This brings us to another point of tension in feudal Japan: the role of religion and spirituality. The samurai and their lords often relied on religious legitimacy to justify their actions. If you could convince the people that your rule was divinely ordained, you could avoid the pressures of political rivalry and maintain control even during times of unrest. The influence of Buddhism, Shinto, and other spiritual beliefs was immense during this time, and it played a major role in legitimizing the power of rulers. By positioning themselves as divinely chosen, samurai and lords could secure the loyalty of their followers and justify their actions, even when those actions were brutal. In many ways, the samurai's connection to spirituality was as important as their connection to the sword. The practice of Zen Buddhism, for example, was intertwined with the samurai's code of conduct. Zen teachings emphasized discipline, mindfulness, and the cultivation of inner peace, all of which helped samurai to stay calm and focused in battle. But the samurai also used their spiritual connection to influence the world around them, framing their actions as part of a divine plan. If a lord had the blessing of the gods, then his rule was seen as unassailable. Even the emperor, with his divine status, was expected to wield his power with spiritual guidance. And if you were a commoner, well, your survival was seen as part of the divine order. But ultimately, your fate was decided by those in power. So, as we look at the world of feudal Japan, we see a system that was both brutal and structured, one that gave power to the few and left the many scrambling to survive. The samurai and the lords lived by a code that demanded loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. But at the same time, they were trapped in a system that kept them under constant scrutiny. The peasants, meanwhile, had little say in the system they were born into, but were often caught in the crossfire of the elite's political games. Survival was never guaranteed, and no matter how hard you worked, how much you honored the code, or how loyal you were, the truth was simple. In feudal Japan, one wrong move could cost you everything. As we inch closer to the final stretch of our journey through feudal Japan, let's take a step back and talk about the real kicker: the power of betrayal. The more you think about it, the more it becomes apparent that the only way to truly survive in this world was to keep your enemies close and your friends even closer. In a society so tightly bound by rules of loyalty and honor, there was always the lurking threat of betrayal. Whether it was within the samurai ranks, the ruling court, or the peasant villages, betrayal could come from any direction, at any time. It was a dangerous game to play, and yet, it was a game that everyone had to participate in. For the samurai, betrayal wasn't just a risk, it was part of their daily reality. These were men who prided themselves on their loyalty, yet even the strongest among them could find themselves stabbed in the back by a rival. Whether it was for land, power, or influence, betrayal could be a means to an end. And it often came in the most unexpected forms. A samurai could spend years building up trust with his lord, only to have that trust shattered by another warrior looking to climb the ranks. Loyalty was valued above all else. But the nature of feudal Japan meant that you were constantly surrounded by enemies waiting for the slightest opening to take your place. Imagine being that samurai, constantly on guard, never able to truly relax or let your guard down. You'd be caught in a constant web of alliances, shifting loyalties, and ever-present intrigue. The reality of this life was that every relationship was a potential risk. You might be loyal to your lord, but what if he decided your value had diminished? What if another samurai or nobleman came in and whispered a few lies into his ear, turning him against you? It wasn't just about strength or skill, it was about managing relationships, knowing who to trust, and always being aware of who could betray you when the time was right. But it wasn't just the samurai who had to live in this dangerous game of trust. For the peasants and lower-ranking nobles, betrayal was also a constant threat. When you lived at the mercy of your lord, your survival often depended on the whims of those in power. And let's be honest, if you were a peasant or a merchant with the ear of the Lord, you'd be constantly watching your back. The moment someone with more power, more influence, or a sharper mind saw your position, they might betray you to take your place. And betrayal didn't always have to be dramatic. It could be subtle, just a whisper to the wrong person, just a nudge in the right direction. And suddenly, you could be ruined. Your land taken, your family dishonored, and your future erased, all for the sake of someone else's ambition. And that's the part that really hits home. The fragility of trust in feudal Japan. Your life wasn't just at the mercy of nature, politics, or military might. It was also at the mercy of those closest to you. Everyone had something to gain, and sometimes the only way to get ahead was to throw someone else under the bus. You could spend years building alliances, maintaining respect, and doing everything right, only for someone else to stab you in the back at the perfect moment. Your entire existence could be altered, all because of a single person's betrayal. The idea of loyalty, so central to the samurai code of Bushido, is often romanticized in modern storytelling, but the truth is that loyalty in feudal Japan was as much about survival as it was about honor. Loyalty was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was expected. It was the glue that held the social fabric together. On the other hand, it was the perfect tool for those looking to manipulate or control others. If you were loyal to the wrong person, you risked your life. If you weren't loyal enough, you risked everything. It was a game where the stakes were life and death, and one wrong move could send you to the gallows or worse. Now, let's talk about the psychological toll that this constant fear of betrayal would have on you. Imagine living your life knowing that no one could be trusted completely, that every alliance could turn into a rivalry at a moment's notice. You'd have to constantly monitor the people around you, always analyzing, always calculating, and always questioning whether someone's smile was genuine or whether it hid the potential for betrayal. Could you sleep at night, knowing that anyone you trusted could turn on you? Could you ever truly relax? Or would you always be waiting for the other shoe to drop? This sense of paranoia, of living under constant threat, was the reality for anyone involved in the power struggles of feudal Japan. Whether you were a peasant in a field or a samurai in the court, the constant awareness of betrayal was something you could never escape. The smallest mistake, the slightest misstep, and your whole world could come crashing down. But for those who survived, for those who learned to play the game better than anyone else, there was a certain power in it, an almost intoxicating sense of control over others. And in a world that prized loyalty and honor above all else, the best way to gain control was to turn those ideals on their head. Historians still argue whether betrayal played as large a role in the downfall of feudal Japan as it appears in the historical records. Some suggest that the endless cycles of loyalty and treachery weakened the samurai class, making them more vulnerable to external threats, while others believe that betrayal was simply part of the natural order of feudal politics. Either way, the fact remains that survival in feudal Japan often meant navigating a world where the lines between friend and foe were constantly shifting, and no one was ever truly safe from betrayal. So, you've made it through the political intrigues, the constant threats, and the brutal realities of daily life in feudal Japan. But there's one last thing you need to understand. The price of power. Sure, you could survive by playing the game, keeping your head down, and navigating the treacherous waters of feudal politics. But what happens when you actually rise to the top? What happens when you win the game? You might think that power means you can finally rest easy, that you can sit back and enjoy the fruits of your labor. But in feudal Japan, that was never the case. The higher you climbed, the more exposed you became. The more power you had, the more enemies you attracted. In this world, being at the top wasn't about relaxation or comfort. It was about constantly fighting to maintain your position. At the peak of power were the shoguns, the military rulers of Japan, who held absolute authority over the country. But their power wasn't given freely, it was constantly challenged. Whether it was from rival lords, ambitious samurai, or the political machinations of the emperor's court, the shoguns were always in a fight to keep control. Imagine being the shogun, living under the constant pressure of keeping your rule intact. You've won the battle. You've risen to the top. But every day is a struggle to stay there. Every move you make is watched. Every decision you make is scrutinized. and every slight against your rule could spark a rebellion or a coup. Power, in feudal Japan, was a volatile thing. It could slip through your fingers in an instant, and the moment you relaxed, you became a target. Now, imagine you're a samurai who has made it to the top, maybe even becoming one of the emperor's trusted generals. You've earned respect, wealth, and land, and your reputation precedes you. But with that power comes responsibility and enemies. The moment you gain a significant position in the court or the military, you're no longer just a warrior. You're a player in a high-stakes game where every decision you make could have life or death consequences. Every alliance you form, every battle you fight, comes with risks. You've made it, yes, but now you're living with the constant knowledge that your life could be snuffed out just as quickly as it was given to you. In fact, the more power you gain, the more you have to keep your wits about you. The samurai may have been revered for their martial prowess, but in the world of the shogunate, political acumen was just as valuable. Power wasn't just won on the battlefield, it was won in the courtrooms, in the alleys, in whispered conversations. The art of negotiation, persuasion, and strategic alliances was just as important as the ability to wield a katana. To maintain your power, you had to be 3 steps ahead of everyone else. If you were a samurai, you couldn't just fight, you had to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast. Let's pause and take a moment to talk about betrayal again. It wasn't just a game of words and politics, it could also be a game of death. If you were a samurai at the top, there was always someone gunning for your position. A slight word, a misplaced glance, a whisper in the ear of your lord, or a political rival. And suddenly, you're the target of a conspiracy. At the highest levels, betrayal wasn't just about dishonor, it was about your very survival. Samurai were trained to defend against physical threats. But how could you defend against someone who could turn the court or your lord against you without ever drawing a sword? The fact is, the more power you gained, the more you had to sacrifice. You couldn't trust anyone completely, not even your closest allies. Everyone had an agenda, and if you didn't play the game perfectly, you'd be discarded. For a samurai or a lord, the price of power wasn't just constant vigilance, it was constant loss. You lost friends, family, loyalty, and trust. You gained wealth and status. But those were fleeting in a world built on power struggles and shifting alliances. Power meant you were constantly on guard, always wondering who would be the next to betray you, the next to plot your downfall. Even if you were the shogun, the ruler of all Japan, you lived in fear of your own people. Historians argue whether the constant danger of betrayal and intrigue made samurai and lords paranoid, or simply more cunning. Some believe it was the nature of the system that bred suspicion and deceit. After all, if your survival depended on alliances, those alliances had to be fragile. Others suggest that the constant plotting and maneuvering ultimately weakened the samurai class, creating a culture of distrust that made it more susceptible to outside invasion or internal collapse. Either way, what's clear is that the pursuit of power, while offering wealth and prestige, came with a steep cost. As a peasant or lower-ranking noble, you never had to worry about these high-level games. But your life wasn't without its own dangers. Power struggles between the samurai or the feudal lords could easily spill over into your village or town. Whether it was the aftermath of a war, a lord's rebellion, or a political upheaval, your life could be turned upside down by forces you had no control over. Your fate was always tied to the whims of the samurai and lords. If they fought, you suffered. If they betrayed each other, you paid the price. If they needed you to fight, you had no choice but to do so. So, no matter where you were in the social hierarchy, power in feudal Japan came at a cost. Whether you were trying to survive as a peasant or vying for position as a samurai, the price you paid was steep. You couldn't relax. You couldn't be complacent. You had to be constantly aware of who was above you, who was below you, and who might be planning your downfall. Even at the top, you were never safe. One wrong move, one misplaced loyalty, and everything you had worked for could be torn away in an instant. And for the common folk, you were left with only the option to endure. Your life, your fate, entirely at the mercy of those in power. As we reach the final chapters of this journey through feudal Japan, let's take a step back and examine the one thing that kept everything from collapsing, the rigid class system. You might think you can escape from it, that you could somehow rise above your station. But in feudal Japan, this wasn't just a hierarchy, it was a life sentence. The social classes were more than just distinctions based on wealth or occupation. They were rigidly enforced boundaries that, once you crossed them, didn't offer a way back. You were born into your place, and if you were lucky, you might live out your days there. If you weren't, well, you probably wouldn't survive the long game. The class system in feudal Japan was one of the most inflexible in history. You had the samurai at the top, then the farmers, artisans, and merchants, with the lowest class being the untouchables. The people who worked in the most disgusting jobs, like cleaning the streets or handling waste. Your status was determined by your birth. And once you were placed in a class, there was very little chance of upward mobility. You didn't get to decide what you wanted to be when you grew up. You got to be exactly what your parents were, unless some external event forced a change. And let's be real, if you were born a peasant, your life was set. There was little room for improvement. You'd spend your days working the fields, paying taxes to your lord, and praying for a good harvest. That's it. It wasn't just the peasants who were trapped, though the samurai, despite their prestige and power, were also confined by their code of honor and by their duty to their lord. Sure, they had the power to fight in wars, make decisions, and control land. But the samurai class was still tightly regulated. If you were born a samurai, you were expected to follow a strict code, bushido, that demanded unwavering loyalty to your lord, a focus on martial prowess, and an absolute commitment to honor. And this wasn't something that could be ignored. You couldn't just wake up one day and decide you didn't want to live by these ideals anymore. No, your very identity was tied to your role in this rigid society. And deviation meant not just disgrace, it meant destruction. But it wasn't just about the samurai and the commoners. The merchants and artisans, though not as revered, still had their own problems. They were technically above the peasant class, but their role was never fully accepted by the samurai. The social hierarchy valued the labor of the peasants. Without them, the land wouldn't produce anything, but merchants and artisans were viewed with suspicion. You see, the ruling class didn't trust people who made their living off trade and business. In their eyes, these individuals didn't contribute in the same way that warriors did. If you were a merchant or an artisan, you were stuck somewhere in the middle, never truly accepted by the elite, but still needed for the system to function. Then, at the very bottom, there were the untouchables, those who performed the dirtiest jobs. These people, often referred to as ita, were responsible for tasks that no one else would dare to do: handling the dead, cleaning streets, and disposing of waste. They were literally considered unclean and were relegated to the lowest rungs of society. They lived on the outskirts of the towns, far from the samurai and the merchants. They were shunned and lived lives of abject poverty, stuck in a position they could never escape. For them, survival was about finding ways to get by, to exist without drawing too much attention. Because in a society that viewed them as less than human, simply existing was a constant battle. Historians still debate whether the class system in feudal Japan was an essential part of maintaining order, or if it was a deeply unjust structure that perpetuated inequality and suffering. Some argue that the strict class distinctions helped keep the peace, preventing rebellion and creating clear social roles. Others suggest that it stifled innovation and oppressed large swaths of the population, making it nearly impossible for anyone to rise above their station. What's clear is that in a society where your birth determined your worth, the chances of a meaningful change in your life were slim to none. For most, it was about survival. Pure and simple. The idea of breaking free from this system seems almost laughable. The thought of someone of low status climbing to the top was a rare exception. More myth than reality. Sure, there were rare cases of peasants rising up or samurai turning against their lords, but they were few and far between. The system was designed to keep the rich and powerful in control, to ensure that they remained at the top and everyone else remained beneath them. The samurai were the enforcers, and the peasants were the laborers, each class perpetuating the system that kept everyone in their place. Imagine the frustration, the hopelessness that must have come from living in such a world. You were born into your role, and unless you were born a samurai or had the rare luck to marry into wealth, you'd never escape your place. The only way to move up was to win favor from a lord or samurai, but that path was rarely open to you. The system wasn't just unforgiving, it was suffocating. It controlled everything about your life, your job, your family, your freedom. You could work your entire life, and at the end of it, the best you could hope for was that your children would have a slightly better life than you. The idea of rising above your class was an impossibility for most, and even if you did manage to climb the social ladder, the cost was often just as high. You'd be expected to forsake your previous identity, adopt the behaviors and values of the class you now belong to, and play by a new set of rules. This wasn't just about surviving, it was about fitting into a mold that had already been created for you, a mold that left little room for anything other than compliance. The class system wasn't just a barrier to success, it was the very fabric that held feudal Japan together. And for the vast majority of people, That fabric was as suffocating as it was inescapable. Historians still debate whether feudal Japan's class system led to its eventual collapse or whether it simply perpetuated an order that lasted centuries. Some suggest that the rise of merchant class power in the later years eventually weakened the system, while others point out that the very rigidity of the system eventually stifled any meaningful innovation. What we do know, however, is that this class structure was the backbone of feudal Japan, a system that kept people in their place, and for the majority of the population, offered very little hope of escape. Now, let's look beyond the rigid structures of society and examine one of the most unforgiving realities of feudal Japan: the absolute unpredictability of life. In a world where everything, from the seasons to your social status, was dictated by forces beyond your control, the idea of stability was a cruel illusion. Imagine living in a society where one bad harvest, a natural disaster, or a lord's whim could completely upend your life. There were no safety nets, no guarantees. One moment, you might be toiling away in your fields, and the next, your village could be burned to the ground by an invading army, a rival lord, or even bandits looking to seize your land. The sense of security was fragile, and your entire existence could be erased in a heartbeat. The harsh reality of living in such a volatile system meant that you had to constantly adapt, or risk being crushed by the forces around you. If you were a peasant, your world was in constant flux. Today, you might be working your land, paying your taxes, and taking care of your family. But tomorrow, the same land you've worked for years could be taken by a samurai lord looking to expand his territory, and your family could be displaced or worse. The reality was that survival wasn't just about working hard. It was about being lucky enough to avoid the numerous threats that constantly loomed over you. You weren't just surviving in a harsh physical world. You were surviving in a world where everything you did could be undone by circumstances beyond your control. Imagine this. You wake up one day, thinking you're safe, when suddenly your lord comes to you and demands more from your crops, more from your labor, and even more taxes to support his wars. If you couldn't provide, you'd be punished. Your village would be forced to work harder, produce more, or risk the lord's soldiers coming to enforce their demands. If the harvest failed, you might be forced to sell your family into indentured servitude just to make ends meet. All your hard work, all the sacrifices, could be wiped out in a moment by the ever-shifting tides of fortune. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was knowing that you had absolutely no control over your fate. Your life was dictated by the whims of the samurai and their lords, and any rebellion or attempt to change things could end in brutal consequences. You were at the mercy of a system that valued order and control over everything else, and those who didn't fit in were crushed. If you were a samurai, your life wasn't much better. Sure, you had power and status, but you had to maintain that status through constant vigilance. If your lord was deposed, you could lose everything. If another samurai rose to power and saw you as a rival, you'd be forced to fight for your life. The moment you relaxed, the moment you stopped being vigilant, you risked being replaced or killed. Even as a samurai, you were constantly at the mercy of the political landscape, and your survival depended on how well you played the game of alliances, betrayal, and loyalty. You had no time for rest. You were always either preparing for war, managing your land, or maintaining your position. Stability was never guaranteed, and the moment you were too comfortable was the moment your downfall began. Historians still argue whether the samurai's constant struggle for power was a result of the feudal system itself, or whether it was simply the nature of the times. Some suggest that the samurai were constantly fighting for dominance because of the unsteady political environment created by the fragmented nature of feudal Japan. Others claim that the samurai's own ambitions were to blame, that they were driven by the pursuit of personal power, rather than the preservation of stability. Either way, the result was the same: constant insecurity. No samurai could ever truly rest easy, knowing that their position could be challenged by a rival, an ally, or even an internal shift in the ruling system. For the common people, however, the lack of stability was far worse. Your entire existence was built around the land you worked, the lord you served, and the whims of nature. You couldn't control any of these forces, and that meant that your survival was in constant jeopardy. Imagine living in a world where your entire livelihood could be destroyed by a drought, a bad harvest, or a sudden attack. That was the reality for peasants in feudal Japan. Even if you were careful, even if you did everything right, you could still lose everything in the blink of an eye. And when you did lose everything, you weren't given the luxury of starting over. You were cast aside, forgotten, and replaced by the next generation of peasants willing to work the land. But even with all the risks, even with the uncertainty of life, there was a certain fatalism in feudal Japan. People knew they had little control over their fate, but they learned to endure, Life wasn't about thriving, it was about surviving. You did what you had to do to get by. And if you managed to make it through the season or the year, you counted yourself lucky. But for many, luck wasn't enough. The social system was designed to keep people in place. And even if you survived one year, you couldn't escape the system that held you down. Survival wasn't guaranteed for anyone, not even the samurai, and it was only through ruthless maneuvering, relentless hard work, and sometimes pure luck that anyone made it out of the system alive. So, as we look back at feudal Japan, what's the takeaway? For most people, life wasn't about building a future or striving for greatness. It was about holding on, about making it through another day, another year. In a world that didn't care whether you lived or died, the few at the top lived in constant fear of betrayal, while those at the bottom lived in constant fear of poverty and violence. It was a society that didn't offer much in terms of hope or opportunity. It was a world that demanded loyalty, and in return, it offered only survival. Historians still debate whether this system could have lasted longer than it did, or if it was doomed to collapse under its own weight. Some say that the rigid class structure and the constant struggle for power were unsustainable, while others believe that the system could have lasted indefinitely if it had been reformed. Whatever the case, what's clear is that life in feudal Japan was a constant struggle, and for most people, there was no escape. Survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about managing to keep your place in a world that would just as easily discard you the moment you were no longer useful. Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time. Imagine you're standing at the edge of a rugged fjord, the smell of salt water in the air, and the sound of wood being expertly shaped by skilled hands. You're about to witness the birth of one of history's most remarkable innovations, the Viking longship. Now, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and do me a favor, post your location and the time there. I love imagining where all of you are while we dive into these ancient stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Viking shipbuilding wasn't just an art, it was the very foundation of their culture. The Vikings were more than just raiders and warriors. They were master shipbuilders and sailors who explored vast seas, traded with distant lands, and even settled in new territories. Without their ships, there would be no Viking saga, no daring voyages, no sagas of glory. These ships were the Vikings' most prized possessions, a perfect marriage of practicality, strength, and beauty. The Viking longship was designed for speed, flexibility, and maneuverability, unlike the giant, lumbering warships of other civilizations. The longship could glide through the water with incredible ease. Whether sailing in open seas or navigating the shallow waters of rivers, these ships could do it all. You've probably seen them in historical movies or documentaries. But what you don't always hear about is how these ships became a symbol of Viking ingenuity and craftsmanship. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' skill in shipbuilding was passed down from earlier cultures, or if it was their own innovation. Some even say that Viking ships were so well engineered that they influenced later European ship designs, something we still see in modern naval architecture. So, as you sit back, imagine the workshop filled with the rhythmic sound of axes and hammers as Viking shipbuilders crafted these stunning vessels from scratch. From the oak wood felled in the forest to the intricate detailing on the bow, every piece of the longship was carefully considered and constructed for one purpose: to conquer the seas. The shipbuilders, often regarded as some of the most skilled craftsmen in the Viking Age, worked in tight-knit communities, with each individual having a specific role in the process. Imagine the scene: several men working in unison, shaping the wooden planks and assembling the frame of the longship. The smell of freshly cut wood mingles with the salty air as they carve out the skeleton of the ship, the beams and planks fitting together like a complex puzzle. It's a beautiful and intense process that requires not only skill, but deep knowledge of wood, the tides, and the flow of water. The process of building a longship started with selecting the perfect trees. The Vikings preferred oak, a wood known for its strength and durability, essential for building a vessel that could withstand the battering of the open sea. Once the trees were felled, the real artistry began. Each plank was carefully shaped and beveled to create the right curve, and they were designed to fit together without the need for nails. This was done through a system of interlocking joints and iron rivets. Historians still argue about how the Vikings achieved such a tight seal between the planks, with some suggesting that the wooden rivets themselves were treated with pitch or resin, giving the hull its iconic durability. Viking ships were built in such a way that they could be taken apart and rebuilt quickly if needed. This adaptability made them perfect for the Viking lifestyle, where raids were often swift and the need for ships could change from one battle to another. The ships could also be hauled overland. Thanks to their relatively lightweight design, this made them incredibly versatile, but also a reflection of the Vikings' resourcefulness and ability to survive in a constantly changing world. Imagine them, rushing from one shore to another, shifting their ships as quickly as the tides themselves. But beyond the sheer technical skill involved, Viking shipbuilding also reflected the Vikings' cultural and spiritual values. The longship was often seen as a symbol of the king's power, a representation of his connection to the gods, and a reflection of his ability to lead his people across both water and the afterlife. Some of the most prestigious longships were adorned with intricate carvings, often of mythological creatures, symbols of protection, or scenes depicting Viking gods like Odin and Thor. The craftsmanship wasn't just practical, it was symbolic, binding the ship to the realm of the divine. Historians still argue whether the carvings on these ships were purely decorative or had deeper meanings. Were they simply meant to impress onlookers, or did they hold magical significance for the Vikings, believed to bring the protection of the gods during their voyages? Some scholars even suggest that the Vikings believed that these ships were their ticket to the afterlife, an entryway to Valhalla, where they would be honored by Odin himself, whether for glory in battle or as a vessel for the soul. The longship was deeply intertwined with Viking identity, and its creation was more than just a technical skill, it was an expression of their worldview. As the Viking Age progressed, shipbuilding became not just an art, but a key element in their identity as seafarers and warriors. The longship, often seen as the crown jewel of Viking craftsmanship, was not just a tool of war, it was a statement. A Viking longship was built for speed, flexibility, and the ability to navigate both open waters and shallow rivers, allowing the Vikings to raid distant shores, but also to disappear into the depths of their home territory. Its design was so ahead of its time that it allowed for incredible versatility, giving the Vikings the upper hand in their raids and explorations. The Vikings didn't just build these ships in the safety of their workshops, they built them on the very shores where their boats would eventually set sail. Picture this, a bustling harbor, the soft thud of a hammer against wood, and the rhythmic sound of saws slicing through oak. The shipbuilders would often work together on the construction of several ships at once, making the most of their available resources. Working with the tide and the weather, they built these ships quickly, sometimes finishing a ship in a matter of weeks or months. Depending on its size and complexity, the process was a race against time, with every moment spent on land an opportunity for the Vikings' enemies to gain the upper hand. Historians still debate the exact methods the Vikings used to accelerate the construction of these ships. While we know that their work was incredibly efficient, scholars argue whether the Vikings employed specialized teams to handle certain parts of the shipbuilding process. Did different groups focus solely on the crafting of the hull, while others concentrated on the design of the sails or oars? The Vikings were known for their communal nature, so it's entirely possible that the shipbuilding process involved a division of labor, each person bringing their expertise to the table, whether through sheer manpower or clever organization. Viking shipbuilding was fast, efficient, and deadly effective. Once the ships were constructed, they were launched into the water, and what a sight it must have been. The longships, with their dragon-headed prows cutting through the waves, would have been a symbol of Viking strength and power as they sailed out of the harbor, ready to conquer or explore the unknown. The speed and agility of these ships were unmatched, and the Vikings used this to their advantage. The ships were not just about getting from one place to another, they were about sending a message to their enemies. The sight of a Viking longship on the horizon meant that a new raid was imminent to their allies. It symbolized a powerful kingdom, ready to face the challenges of the world. The longship's design also made it possible for the Vikings to transport not only warriors but goods, cattle, and families across vast distances. This made it an ideal vessel for their journeys of exploration. Viking explorers, such as Leif Erikson, are believed to have sailed as far west as North America, across the vast and unpredictable Atlantic. The idea that these sturdy ships could brave the open ocean, navigate unknown shores, and still return home speaks volumes about their engineering. The longship wasn't just a boat, it was a symbol of Viking resilience and adaptability, a tool that allowed them to control the seas and leave their mark on history. However, as time went on, Viking shipbuilding began to evolve. The longships were gradually replaced by larger, more specialized vessels, such as the Nars, cargo ships that could carry goods over longer distances. These ships were designed to handle greater loads, but they sacrificed some of the speed and agility that made the longships so effective in battle and exploration. As the Vikings' expansion slowed and their raids became less frequent, their ships adapted to the changing needs of the people. Yet, despite the change in ship design, the legacy of Viking shipbuilding lives on. The longship, with its graceful curves and intricate carvings, remains a lasting symbol of Viking ingenuity and the spirit of adventure that defined an era. Now, let's shift gears a bit and think about the materials Viking shipbuilders used, specifically the wood. If you've ever imagined a Viking ship, you might picture towering oak trees being felled in the forests of Scandinavia, the towering masts and sturdy hulls being crafted from the finest timber. Well, you wouldn't be too far from the truth, except for one crucial detail. The Vikings didn't just choose any wood. They selected specific types of trees that could offer both durability and flexibility, a balance that was key to the success of their ships. Oak was often the go-to choice, prized for its strength, but they also used pine and ash for different parts of the ship. Taking advantage of the unique qualities of each tree, the timber was sourced from the surrounding woodlands, with the Vikings carefully selecting trees that had the right balance of age and strength. A tree that was too old would be brittle and likely to crack under pressure, while a tree too young wouldn't have the strength needed for the heavy demands of shipbuilding. Vikings had an uncanny ability to select the right trees, thanks to centuries of experience and a deep understanding of their environment. It wasn't just about grabbing any tree and getting to work. They treated the forest with the same respect and care they gave to their ships. The wood had to be cut, shaped, and treated with precision to ensure that the longship could handle both the weight of the crew and the force of the waves. Once the trees were felled, the timber had to be transported to the shipbuilding site. This was no small feat in a time before trucks and cranes. Logs were often dragged over land or transported along rivers to the construction site, with entire teams of people working together to get the materials where they were needed. Given the Vikings' advanced knowledge of waterway systems and the many rivers that crisscrossed their territory, this task was often easier than it may sound. But it still required incredible coordination and effort. It's easy to imagine the sight of massive logs being floated downriver or hauled across snowy terrain by a team of men, their faces set in determination, the tree's rough bark still fresh from the forest. As the shipbuilding process moved forward, the timber would be cut into planks, shaped, and fitted together like a giant wooden puzzle. One of the key features of Viking shipbuilding was their use of overlapping planks, known as clinker building. This technique, which involved fitting planks edge to edge with the seams slightly raised, allowed the ship to be both strong and flexible, able to withstand the harsh conditions of the sea. The overlap also created space for a thicker, more robust structure, which gave the ships additional buoyancy and the ability to ride the waves with remarkable stability. This was an early example of Viking ingenuity, showcasing how their shipbuilders were able to create vessels that could take on both the high seas and the shallower rivers with ease. Historians still debate how exactly these ships were constructed with such speed and efficiency. While we know that the Vikings had a well-developed system of organization, the details remain elusive. Did each shipbuilder specialize in one part of the ship, or were they all generalists, skilled in every aspect of the process? Some scholars suggest that the Vikings used templates, a kind of blueprint for each ship design, allowing them to replicate their ships quickly and with minimal error. Others believe that shipbuilding was a much more organic process, with each ship a unique creation, tailored to the needs of its specific mission. The truth, as with many aspects of Viking life, may lie somewhere in between. Once the planks were in place, the ship was ready for its ribs and frames, which gave the vessel its shape and added structural integrity. The ribs of a Viking longship weren't just functional, they were designed with care, often beautifully carved with intricate patterns or symbols that were meant to represent both protection and the spirit of the ship. Some scholars suggest that these carvings were more than just decorative. They were likely symbolic, invoking the power of the gods and ensuring the success of the ship on its journeys. The Vikings were deeply spiritual people, and they infused every aspect of their shipbuilding with a connection to the divine. As the ship neared completion, the final touches would be added: sails, rudders, and shields. The sails of Viking ships were typically made from wool and linen, often dyed in bold colors that could be seen from a distance. Each sail would be carefully hoisted and adjusted, and once it was in place, the longship was ready to embark on its next journey. Whether it was a raid, a trade mission, or an exploration into the unknown, the shields, which were often attached to the sides of the ship, were equally important, both as a defensive feature and as a symbolic marker of the ship's power and identity. The final step in the process was the christening of the ship, a ritual that was just as important as the construction itself. Ships were often named after gods or legendary heroes, with the idea that the ship would carry the spirit of its namesake with it on its journeys. Once completed and blessed, the ship would be launched into the water, and the Vikings would celebrate with feasts, music, and the knowledge that their creation, this extraordinary vessel, was ready to face whatever the sea had in store. As the Viking ships slid into the water, the craftsmanship became apparent in the ship's performance. It wasn't just a marvel of engineering, it was also a masterpiece of design, capable of maneuvering through both open seas and shallow rivers with equal grace. But let's step back for a moment and think about what made Viking ships so incredibly versatile. It wasn't just the sturdy wood or the shape, it was the incredible attention to detail given to every aspect of the ship's design. Take, for instance, the size and shape of the hull. Viking ships were long and narrow, designed for speed and agility, making them perfect for swift attacks on unsuspecting coastal towns. But they were also shallow enough to navigate through the shallow waters of rivers, allowing the Vikings to launch raids deep into Europe's interior. The shallow draft of the Viking longship also allowed it to be easily beached. This was a huge advantage when it came to raiding, as it meant that the Vikings could land on almost any beach, no matter how small. Once they landed, they could quickly unload their warriors, loot, and reboard, all within a matter of hours. The ability to beach the ship and then quickly retreat was a key aspect of Viking warfare, giving them the element of surprise and ensuring they could strike and disappear before the enemy could respond. But while the ship was designed for fast attacks, it was also remarkably durable. The overlapping planks, or clinker-built design, gave the ship a flexibility that allowed it to withstand the pounding of waves without breaking apart. The ship's curves and hulls were crafted in such a way that they could absorb the shock of rough seas, which allowed the Vikings to travel farther and for longer periods. In fact, some of the most daring Viking expeditions were made possible by the durability and seaworthiness of their ships. The Norse explorers used these ships to travel to far-off lands like Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, hundreds of years before Columbus ever set sail. Historians still argue about the specifics of the Viking longship's durability. Some claim that the ships were built for speed above all else, sacrificing durability for lighter weight. Others suggest that the Vikings were just as concerned with the ship's long-term endurance, making sure the ship could withstand the harshest elements of the North Atlantic. One thing is for certain, though, the Viking longship was a work of art in both form and function. The ships represented everything the Vikings stood for: speed, strength, and resilience. Let's also take a moment to think about the rigging of the ship, which was just as important as the hull itself. Viking ships had a single large sail, which was used to catch the wind and propel the ship forward. The sail was made from wool and linen, often dyed in bright colors, and was hoisted on a single mast. This sail was large enough to catch the wind and speed the ship along, but it could also be lowered or raised as needed. The sails were fastened to the ship with ropes, and sailors were trained in the art of quickly adjusting the sails to account for shifting winds. The mastery of rigging was something that every Viking sailor had to learn. Getting the rigging just right was what allowed them to control the ship in the open seas. Without the correct wind, the longship would be reduced to floating, and the Vikings knew how to adjust sails for both speed and precision. The rudder of the Viking longship was another key feature. Unlike many other ships of the time, Viking longships had a single large rudder, mounted on the side of the ship. This rudder was controlled by a helmsman, who would use ropes and pulleys to steer the ship through the water. The rudder was a crucial part of the ship's agility, allowing it to turn quickly and navigate tight spaces. This innovation made the Viking longship a standout vessel, able to outmaneuver many of its rivals. Historians are still debating the full scope of Viking naval technology. The rudder, for instance, was a relatively new feature in the 9th and 10th centuries. It's possible that the Vikings learned how to incorporate it from their contact with other cultures, such as the Anglo-Saxons, or they may have developed it independently. The addition of a single rudder, rather than multiple oars, was a significant advancement that made it easier to steer the longship and gave it the flexibility needed to navigate through the ever-changing seas of the North Atlantic. The Viking longship was, in essence, a floating fortress designed for both beauty and power. Its speed and durability made it one of the most effective military tools of its time, but it also served as a symbol of the Viking culture. The longship was often decorated with ornate carvings, including animal motifs, dragon heads, and other symbols of the Viking gods. These decorations served as a reminder that these ships weren't just practical tools, they were also works of art, imbued with spiritual significance. The Viking longship was a vehicle of the gods, and as such, it carried with it the power and strength of the divine. The Viking longship was also symbolic in another way: its ability to transcend borders. These ships were not just used for raiding, they were also used for exploration, trade, and colonization. Viking explorers ventured far and wide, leaving their mark on distant lands. From the coasts of North America to the rivers of Russia, the longship allowed the Vikings to travel where no other ships could go, and it helped them establish a cultural and political presence across Europe and beyond. Even today, The Viking longship stands as a symbol of adventure and exploration, a testament to the strength and courage of those who sailed it. As we continue to examine the Viking longship's remarkable design, let's turn our attention to its crew, the warriors, sailors, and craftsmen who made these ships so effective in battle and exploration. The Vikings were not only skilled shipbuilders but also adept sailors, and a successful voyage required the combined efforts of many hands. Each crew member had a specific role, and they worked in harmony to ensure that the ship performed at its best. Whether they were voyaging to foreign lands or raiding coastal towns, the oarsmen, for instance, were essential to the longship's speed and agility. Viking longships were powered by a combination of sails and oars. While the sail could catch the wind and propel the ship forward, the oars were crucial for maneuvering and for situations when the wind was too weak to fill the sail. It's believed that the oarsmen were usually positioned in pairs, with each pair working together to row in unison. This teamwork allowed the ship to glide smoothly through the water, even in calm conditions. The rhythmic sound of the oars dipping into the water was a familiar one to any Viking sailor. Historians still debate the exact number of oarsmen that a Viking longship would carry, but it's clear that they could range from a handful on smaller ships to as many as 30 or more on larger vessels. Each oar was typically manned by a single sailor, although some ships used larger crews, with multiple men per oar. The Viking longship's design allowed for such flexibility, making it ideal for both small, swift attacks and larger operations that required greater manpower. At the stern of the ship stood the helmsman, who controlled the rudder and steered the ship through the waters. Unlike other ships of the time, which had multiple rudders or complex steering mechanisms, the Viking longship employed a single large rudder. This rudder was controlled by ropes and pulleys, allowing the helmsman to make quick adjustments to the ship's course. The rudder's placement on the right side of the ship allowed for greater control and made the longship more maneuverable in tight spaces, which was crucial during coastal raids. The helmsman's skill in navigating was vital, after all. The Vikings often sailed in unfamiliar waters, making their way through narrow fjords or deep rivers, where precise steering was paramount. As the ship's warriors were perhaps its most famous aspect, we should also take a closer look at their role in Viking society. The warriors who sailed these longships were not just fierce raiders, they were also a well-trained, disciplined group, accustomed to working together. In fact, the Vikings were known for their remarkable ability to coordinate their movements, whether in battle or on a voyage. The ship's design allowed for this coordination, as the oarsmen had to synchronize their movements to make the ship move smoothly. Similarly, in battle, the warriors were highly trained in the use of their weapons and in executing military tactics as a unit. In the Viking raids, it was common to see the longship approach a coastal town under the cover of darkness, with its crew of warriors waiting for the signal to land. Once the ship reached the shore, the warriors would leap from the ship and storm the beach, using their swords, axes, and shields to overpower any resistance. The ship's agility allowed the Vikings to approach from unexpected angles, and their ability to move quickly in and out of battle was a key reason they were so successful. One of the most interesting aspects of the Viking longship was its ability to serve both as a warship and as a transport vessel. The same ship that was used for raiding could also be used for exploring new lands or transporting goods. The Vikings' incredible adaptability and their use of the longship for multiple purposes were critical to their success as both warriors and traders. The ships were designed to be versatile, and their crews were just as adaptable, capable of performing both military and civilian tasks as needed. In addition to its crew and functionality, the Viking longship was also a cultural symbol for the Vikings. The ship was more than just a tool of war or exploration. It was a representation of Viking identity. The longship was seen as a symbol of strength, freedom, and divine favor. Many Viking longships were adorned with intricate carvings of animals, warriors, and gods, each design telling a story or invoking the protection of a deity. These carvings were not just ornamental, they were deeply spiritual, reflecting the Viking belief in the power of the gods and the connection between the ship and the divine. Historians still argue about the exact significance of the carvings on Viking longships. Some believe that they were purely decorative, intended to display the wealth and status of the ship's owner. Others argue that these carvings had a more spiritual purpose, serving as a form of protection or as a way to honor the gods. Regardless of their intended purpose, these carvings added to the mystique and power of the longship, making it not just a physical tool but a vessel imbued with meaning. The Vikings' connection to their ships went beyond their use in battle or exploration. They were also central to their funerary practices. When a Viking chieftain or warrior died, it was common for them to be buried in a ship, which would be placed in a burial mound. This practice reflected the belief that the ship was a key part of the Vikings' journey to the afterlife. Some burial mounds even contained full-sized longships, which were used as both a vessel for the deceased and a symbol of their status in life. The Viking longship, therefore, was not just a vehicle for physical travel, it was a conduit for spiritual journeying as well, from the warriors who manned the oars to the chieftains whose ships carried them into the afterlife. The longship was central to the Viking worldview, tying together their daily lives, their warfare, and their beliefs about the divine. In the end, the Viking longship stands as a testament to the ingenuity, adaptability, and spirituality of the Vikings, whose legacy continues to capture our imagination to this day. As we reflect on the exceptional craftsmanship of the Viking longship and its crucial role in Viking society, it's important to recognize that these ships were not just the product of one man's labor. They were the result of a deeply skilled community of builders, sailors, and artisans who passed down their knowledge over generations. Shipbuilding in Viking society was a revered craft, and the techniques used to construct these ships were nothing short of remarkable. The process involved an intricate mix of artistry, engineering, and practical knowledge that spanned both land and sea. The construction of a Viking longship was no simple task. It required an intimate understanding of materials and the ability to work in harmony with nature. The main material used for the longships was oak, a strong and durable wood that could withstand the harsh conditions of both the open sea and the riverbanks. This was no ordinary wood. It had to be carefully selected, with the best oak being chosen for the keel. The backbone of the ship? Builders believed that the wood's natural strength and flexibility gave the ship its characteristic ability to bend with the waves, ensuring that the ship wouldn't break under the pressure of stormy seas. Historians still argue over the specific techniques used by Viking shipbuilders, but it's clear that their methods were a well-kept secret passed down through generations. Some scholars suggest that the Vikings used an early form of clinker-built construction, a method where the wooden planks of the ship overlapped, creating a flexible and sturdy hull. This technique made the ship lighter and faster, which was essential for raiding and exploration. Others believe that the Vikings used a combination of both clinker and carvel construction methods, where the planks were laid edge to edge rather than overlapping. The process of building a longship was highly collaborative, with different experts in the community, each contributing their specialized skills. While the shipbuilders were focused on constructing the hull and ensuring the ship was seaworthy, other artisans would work on the details, carving intricate designs into the ship's sides and creating the protective shields that would adorn the ship's gunnels. These shields were not just for decoration, they were part of the ship's design, with each shield representing the identity of the ship and its crew. The shield's vibrant colors and unique designs were meant to inspire fear in enemies and unity among the crew. Once the ship's frame was assembled, the crew of artisans and builders would move on to the final touches, the addition of the mast, the sail, and the rudder. The Viking longship was a sail-powered vessel, but its ability to row was just as important. The mast, made of pine, was designed to be both tall and sturdy, allowing for the sail to catch the wind efficiently. The sail itself was usually made of wool or linen and was often dyed with bright colors to match the shields and decorative designs of the ship. This combination of materials ensured that the longship could navigate both with wind and through the strength of its rowers. In the Viking Age, a ship wasn't just a tool for travel, it was a status symbol, a work of art, and a vital part of Viking culture. Kings, chieftains, and wealthy warriors often commissioned their longships from the most skilled builders in the land. These ships were made to last for generations, and the quality of craftsmanship in Viking shipbuilding was unmatched. It's said that some longships were so well built that they could survive for hundreds of years, a testament to the enduring knowledge and skills of the builders. One of the most impressive aspects of Viking shipbuilding was the incredible speed with which these ships could be constructed. A Viking longship could be built in just a few months, and it's believed that this rapid construction was due to the mastery of the shipbuilding process and the communal effort involved. Builders worked together as a team, each person playing their part to ensure the ship was built to perfection. It's likely that the community also played a role in the ship's launch, with ceremonies and celebrations marking the occasion. Historians still debate the specifics of Viking shipbuilding techniques, but there is no doubt that these ships were a cornerstone of Viking society. The longship's combination of strength, speed, and versatility made it ideal for both warfare and exploration, and it was essential to the Vikings' success as seafarers, traders, and raiders. For centuries, the longship was a symbol of Viking power and ingenuity, allowing them to expand their influence across the seas and create an empire that spanned from North America to the Mediterranean. The Vikings' deep connection to their ships can also be seen in the art and poetry of the time. Ships were frequently depicted in Viking sagas, where they were portrayed as vessels of power and destiny. Some sagas even describe ships as having their own personalities, with the sea itself being seen as a living entity that could be both a friend and a foe. The idea that ships had a spirit and were tied to the fate of their crew was an important part of Viking culture. In this way, the Viking longship was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of the Viking way of life. As we reflect on the Viking longship, it's clear that its design was a work of art that reflected both the practicality of Viking life and the spiritual beliefs that guided them. The ship's unique combination of function and beauty made it a powerful tool for the Vikings, enabling them to traverse vast distances and conquer new lands. But it also served as a symbol of the Vikings' relationship with the natural world, their gods, and their way of life. The longship was more than just a ship, it was a vessel of destiny, a key to their success, and a testament to the skill and ingenuity of the Viking people. Now, we shift focus to the cultural importance of Viking ships beyond just their practical uses. The longship wasn't merely a tool for conquest or exploration, it also served as a profound symbol of identity, power, and divine connection for the Vikings. Ships played a significant role in Viking religious beliefs, reflecting the Vikings' deep connection to the sea and their understanding of fate and gods. The reverence for their ships was not limited to their use in battle or trade, but extended into the realm of spirituality. One of the most compelling examples of this is the Viking burial ship, a practice that showcased the ship's role as a bridge between the earthly and divine realms. When a Viking chief or warrior died, they were often placed in a ship, sometimes even a full-size longship, and buried with their belongings. The ship, in this case, wasn't just a means of transportation, it was believed to help carry the deceased soul to the afterlife. The burial ships were often placed in mounds or grave sites near the coast, a final voyage of sorts, ensuring that the individual would be able to sail to the next world. Historians still debate the exact religious significance of these ship burials. Some suggest that the ships were a symbolic representation of the journey to the afterlife, with the ship serving as a conduit for the soul's passage. Others argue that the ship's inclusion in the burial was tied to the idea of rebirth and continuity, signifying that the individual would be eternally linked to the sea and to their ship, even after death. The grand ships used in these burials were often adorned with shields, weapons, and personal items, signifying the status and wealth of the deceased. The most famous of these Viking ship burials is the Oseberg ship. Discovered in Norway in 1904, this well-preserved burial ship, dating back to around 834 CE, provides us with a glimpse into the grandeur of Viking burial customs. The Oseberg ship is believed to have been used to bury two high-ranking women, with the ship itself being lavishly decorated and filled with artifacts that highlight the status and importance of the individuals buried within it. The intricate carvings on the ship, which depict animals and mythical creatures, suggest that the ship was not just a grave but a sacred object imbued with spiritual significance. In addition to serving as a burial vessel, Viking ships also held a central place in religious rituals and festivals. The Vikings were known to hold great feasts and celebrations to honor their gods, and these events often included ritual boat processions. In these ceremonies, longships were filled with offerings to the gods, and they were either sailed or carried to sacred sites, where sacrifices and prayers were made. These processions were seen as a way to ensure that the gods would favor the Vikings, granting them victory in battle and favorable winds for their voyages. Historians have long debated the exact nature of Viking religious beliefs. Some argue that the Vikings were deeply polytheistic, with a pantheon of gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, each overseeing different aspects of life and nature. Others suggest that the Vikings believed in a more animistic worldview, where the forces of nature, such as the sea, sky, and forest, were inhabited by spirits that needed to be appeased. Regardless of the specifics, it's clear that the ship, as both a physical and symbolic object, was intimately connected to the Vikings' understanding of the divine and the supernatural. The importance of the ship in Viking culture also extended to the art and literature of the time. Longships, with their sleek and powerful designs, were often featured in Viking sagas, poems, and artwork. In these stories, the ships were frequently depicted as instruments of fate, carrying warriors to battle or helping them achieve glory. The ship was a central part of the Vikings' identity, embodying their martial prowess, their connection to the sea, and their belief in destiny. In the Viking sagas, ships were often described in poetic terms, as though they were living beings capable of great feats. One of the most famous sagas, the Saga of the Inglings, tells the story of the royal family's connection to the gods, with ships playing a key role in the narrative. The saga paints the image of a royal family that used their ships not just for warfare but for divine purposes. with their vessels acting as vessels of the gods. In these stories, ships are not merely tools, they are characters in their own right, imbued with the power and agency of the divine. Moreover, ships were central to the Vikings' daily life and cultural exchanges. The longship, with its adaptability, made it possible for the Vikings to establish trade routes, invade lands, and participate in the broader world of medieval Europe. These ships were essential to the Vikings' way of life, whether it was through violent raids, peaceful trade, or exploration. They bridged the gap between distant cultures and allowed the Vikings to exert influence across a vast stretch of land. From the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean, it's easy to see why Viking ships were not just utilitarian objects but also vessels of identity, culture, and spirituality. Their symbolic significance was woven into the very fabric of Viking society, serving as a link between the mortal realm and the divine. The Vikings' connection to their ships was an expression of their understanding of the world, and it remains one of the most fascinating aspects of their culture. Whether they were used for burial, for spiritual ceremonies, or for voyages across distant seas, these ships held a profound place in the hearts and minds of the Viking people. As we continue exploring the fascinating connection between Vikings and their ships, it's time to look at how the Vikings' incredible shipbuilding techniques contributed to their unmatched ability to navigate and conquer vast stretches of land and sea. The technological and engineering marvels that were the Viking longships were unlike any other ships of their time. While the rest of Europe relied on bulky, slow-moving vessels, the Viking longship was fast, flexible, and designed to be equally effective in both open waters and shallow rivers. The longship allowed the Vikings to explore, raid, and trade with incredible efficiency, which helped establish their dominance during the Viking Age. The secret to the longship's success lay in its construction. Viking shipbuilders, known as batasmidir, were highly skilled artisans who employed sophisticated techniques to craft vessels that were both sturdy and agile. The ships were made with overlapping planks, a technique known as clinker building. This method involved the use of long, narrow planks that were riveted together, creating a flexible and strong hull that could withstand the harsh conditions of the northern seas. This design also allowed the ships to be lighter, making them easier to maneuver and faster on water, an essential feature when engaging in surprise raids. Historians still argue over the exact origins of clinker building. Some believe it was developed by the Vikings themselves, while others suggest it was influenced by earlier traditions in the British Isles or Scandinavia. Regardless of its origins, this method of shipbuilding revolutionized naval design. The longship's lightweight, flexible construction meant that it could be rapidly deployed for both long voyages across the North Atlantic and for shallow river expeditions, where larger vessels would be incapable of navigating. This adaptability allowed the Vikings to strike quickly, often before their enemies had time to react. But it wasn't just the construction that made the Viking longship so exceptional. It was also its speed. A fully manned longship could sail at speeds of up to 15 knots, which was remarkable for its time. The ship's sleek, narrow design and the use of oars, in addition to sails, gave it an unmatched ability to move swiftly through both calm and rough waters. This speed was crucial during raids, as it allowed Vikings to quickly reach coastal villages, overpower their enemies, and retreat before reinforcements could arrive. The longship was an embodiment of Viking warfare, fast, efficient, and devastating. Interestingly, Viking ships weren't just military machines, they were also used for exploration. The Vikings were some of the earliest European explorers to venture across the Atlantic Ocean, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. The longship's ability to handle rough seas and traverse vast distances made it the perfect vessel for these pioneering voyages. It is believed that Norse explorers, led by Leif Erikson, used longships to reach what is now Newfoundland, Canada, around the year 1000, almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus set sail for the New World. Historians still debate the significance of these Viking explorations. Some argue that the Vikings were simply opportunistic traders and raiders, while others suggest that they were driven by a spirit of adventure and curiosity, exploring new lands for settlement and trade. Regardless of their motivations, the Viking longship played a crucial role in their ability to explore and conquer new territories. The ship allowed them to establish settlements in remote areas, bringing them into contact with other cultures and expanding the Viking influence across the North Atlantic. In addition to their military and exploratory uses, Viking ships were also vital for trade. The Vikings established a vast network of trade routes that spanned from the British Isles to the Mediterranean, and from the Volga River to the North American coast. They traded goods such as furs, timber, and weapons, as well as slaves and exotic goods from distant lands. The longship, with its ability to travel quickly and navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, made it an ideal vessel for carrying goods across these vast distances. Viking trading settlements, such as those in Kiev and the city of Birka in Sweden, became important hubs in the medieval trade networks. As the Viking Age came to an end and their kingdoms began to settle into more established states, the longship's role shifted. It remained a symbol of Viking power and prestige, used for ceremonial purposes and as a sign of the king's wealth and influence. Royal Viking ships were often lavishly decorated, with intricate carvings of animals, warriors, and gods. Reflecting the importance of the ship in Viking culture, the ships were not only practical tools of war and trade, but also powerful symbols of the Viking people's strength, ingenuity, and connection to the divine. Today, the legacy of Viking shipbuilding lives on through archaeological discoveries and modern reconstructions of Viking ships. The longship, in its various forms, remains one of the most iconic and enduring symbols of Viking culture. It's a testament to the Vikings' ingenuity and adaptability, allowing them to navigate a world of vast oceans, icy seas, and turbulent political landscapes, whether used for exploration, trade, or war. The Viking longship remains a powerful reminder of the Viking Age's far-reaching influence. As we continue to explore the extraordinary craftsmanship behind Viking shipbuilding, it's important to understand that the construction of these vessels was not just a technical achievement, but a highly communal effort. Shipbuilding was a collaborative process that involved a wide range of skilled workers, each contributing their expertise to create a vessel capable of withstanding the harshest conditions. From master shipwrights to laborers hauling timber, the entire community played a role in the creation of a Viking ship. This collective effort was a reflection of the Viking society itself, one that valued teamwork, resilience, and shared responsibility. The shipbuilding process began in the forests, where trees were felled by hand using axes and saws. The Vikings preferred using oak wood for the construction of their ships, as it was sturdy and durable, ideal for the rough seas they navigated. The trees had to be carefully selected, ensuring that the wood was free of knots and defects. Once the trees were felled, the logs were transported to shipyards by sleds or boats, where the real work began. Viking shipyards were bustling hubs of activity, with craftsmen, carpenters, and laborers working in unison to turn raw timber into magnificent vessels. Historians still debate the exact methods used by the Vikings to cut and shape their wood, with some suggesting that they employed advanced techniques such as steam bending to shape the planks. Steam bending involves heating the wood with steam and then bending it into the desired shape, a technique that would have been particularly useful for creating the curved, flexible hulls of the longships. Others believe that the Vikings used simpler methods, relying on the natural shape of the wood and using tools such as chisels and mallets to carve the planks. Regardless of the specific techniques, it's clear that Viking shipbuilders were highly skilled in manipulating wood to create strong, flexible, and watertight vessels. Once the planks were shaped, they were joined together using a technique known as clinker building. The overlapping planks were riveted together with iron nails, creating a strong but flexible hull. The use of rivets, rather than nails, allowed the ship to absorb the shocks of rough seas without breaking apart. The clinker building technique also gave the ship its distinctive, sleek appearance, with the planks flaring outward from the keel. This design helped to distribute the forces of the waves evenly across the hull, preventing damage and making the ship more stable in turbulent waters. As the ship began to take shape, the craftsmen would move on to the finer details. The Viking longship was known for its intricate and symbolic decorations, which often included carvings of animals, warriors, and gods. The figureheads, in particular, were an important aspect of the ship's design, with each longship typically featuring a carved figure at the bow. These figureheads were believed to offer protection to the ship and its crew, as they were thought to embody the spirit of the gods or heroic ancestors. The figureheads were often designed to be fearsome, with snarling wolves, roaring lions, and serpentine dragons, adding a sense of mysticism and power to the ship's appearance. The sails of the longship were another important feature. Made from wool or linen, the sails were often brightly colored, with geometric patterns or symbols woven into the fabric. The Vikings used a square sail, which could be raised and lowered to catch the wind. This sail design allowed for greater control and maneuverability, particularly when sailing into or out of harbors. The sail was attached to a long wooden spar, known as the yard, which could be adjusted to change the angle of the sail depending on the wind. This flexibility allowed Viking ships to sail with ease across the open seas, as well as navigate narrow rivers and shallow coastal waters. Interestingly, the use of sails in Viking ships was not just for propulsion, it also had a symbolic significance. The sail was a key feature of Viking raids, as the sight of a longship with its sail billowing in the wind was often a sign that the Vikings were coming. The image of the sail, often depicted in Viking sagas and artwork, became a symbol of Viking power and dominance on the seas. In fact, the very design of the longship, sleek, fast, and able to cut through the waves with ease, was a reflection of the Viking way of life. Adaptable, resourceful, and fearless in the face of challenge. As the ship neared completion, it was time for the final touches. The Vikings believed that the ship needed to be christened before its maiden voyage, often with a ritual that included sacrifices or offerings to the gods. This act was believed to ensure the ship's success in battle, trade, or exploration. The ship would then be launched into the water, often accompanied by celebrations and festivities. Once afloat, the longship would be ready for its primary purpose: to carry the Viking warriors, traders, and explorers across vast distances, from the shores of Scandinavia to the distant lands of the Mediterranean, the British Isles, and even the Americas. The Viking longship was a marvel of engineering and craftsmanship, built with skill, precision, and a deep understanding of the natural world. Each ship was a testament to the ingenuity of the Viking people, who, despite living in a harsh and unforgiving environment, created a culture that was capable of thriving through adaptability and resourcefulness. The longship, with its sleek design, powerful propulsion, and symbolic significance, was not just a means of transportation, it was a reflection of the Viking spirit itself. Today, we continue to marvel at the Viking longship, as evidenced by the preservation of Viking ships in museums and archaeological sites. These ships, which were once tools of conquest, trade, and exploration, now serve as reminders of the extraordinary legacy of the Vikings. As we explore the history of Viking shipbuilding, we are reminded not just of the power of these vessels, but also of the enduring spirit of the people who built them. As we reflect on the remarkable skill of Viking shipbuilders, it's essential to consider how these ships influenced the Vikings' ability to extend their reach across the world. The Viking longship was more than just a vessel. It was a versatile tool for expansion, warfare, and exploration. Thanks to the ingenuity of Viking shipbuilders, the Vikings could navigate treacherous waters, raid coastal towns, and even establish settlements far from their homeland. Their ships allowed them to conquer vast distances, and in doing so, they left their mark on history. One of the key features that made the Viking longship so effective was its design, which allowed it to operate in both the open sea and on rivers. The shallow draft of the longship meant that it could sail through shallow waters, such as rivers and estuaries, where other ships of the time would have been grounded. This made the Viking longship incredibly adaptable, allowing the Vikings to reach places that were previously inaccessible. Their ships could also land on beaches, which was particularly useful for launching raids. The longship's ability to navigate both open seas and rivers made it an essential part of Viking conquest, trade, and exploration. Historians still debate whether the Viking longships were truly superior to the ships of other cultures during the medieval period. Some argue that the Viking longship's combination of speed, maneuverability, and shallow draft gave it a distinct advantage, while others suggest that other civilizations, such as the Mediterranean powers, had equally formidable ships. However, what remains clear is that the Viking longship played a crucial role in the Vikings' ability to strike fear into their enemies and establish a far-reaching network of settlements, trade routes, and cultural exchange. Beyond their military and raiding capabilities, Viking ships were also integral to the Vikings' exploration of distant lands. The Vikings are often credited with being the first Europeans to discover North America, hundreds of years before Christopher Columbus set sail. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, is believed to have sailed to the coast of North America around the year 1000, landing in what is now Newfoundland, Canada. This journey, made possible by the Viking longship, marked the beginning of European exploration of the New World. Long before the age of exploration in the 15th century, the Viking longship's reach extended far beyond Europe and North America. Vikings also explored the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and even parts of Asia. Their ships allowed them to trade with distant peoples, exchanging goods such as furs, slaves, and metalwork for luxury items like silk, spices, and silver. The Vikings were adept traders, and their ships played a crucial role in the establishment of long-distance trade networks that spanned from the British Isles to the Caspian Sea. These trade routes allowed the Vikings to become one of the most prosperous and influential civilizations of the medieval period. Yet, despite their technological prowess, Viking shipbuilders were not without challenges. One of the most significant hurdles was the constant need for resources, particularly timber. The Viking longship required vast quantities of oak, and the Vikings had to rely on the forests of Scandinavia to meet their demands. However, as the Vikings expanded their territories and settled in new lands, they faced the depletion of local timber supplies. This led to the Vikings having to travel even further to find suitable trees, sometimes crossing into lands that were not always friendly. This reliance on timber became a strategic challenge as the Vikings pushed farther from their homeland. Another challenge faced by Viking shipbuilders was the constant battle against time. The construction of a longship was a time-consuming process, often taking months or even years to complete. During times of war, the need for ships was urgent, and shipbuilders had to work quickly to meet the demands of the king or chieftain. This urgency often led to rushed work, and Viking ships were not always built to the same standards of precision as their predecessors. Nevertheless, despite these challenges, Viking shipbuilders continued to produce vessels that were capable of withstanding the harsh conditions of the North Atlantic and beyond. As we think about the Viking longship and its impact on the Vikings' success, we must also consider the cultural significance of these ships. For the Vikings, ships were more than just tools for survival. They were symbols of status, power, and identity. Kings and chieftains often commissioned large, elaborately decorated ships to demonstrate their wealth and influence. These ships were not only used for warfare and trade, but also for ceremonial purposes, such as burials. The Vikings believed that ships could carry the souls of the dead to the afterlife, and many Viking kings and warriors were buried in ships, along with their treasures and weapons, to ensure a safe journey to Valhalla. The craftsmanship involved in creating these ceremonial ships was particularly remarkable. These ships were often adorned with intricate carvings, depicting scenes from Norse mythology, heroic deeds, or divine figures. The figureheads, typically representing animals like dragons, wolves, or serpents, were thought to offer protection to the ship and its crew. These artistic touches gave the ships a sense of grandeur and reverence, elevating them beyond mere vessels to symbols of power and spirituality. In many ways, the Viking longship was not just a means of transportation or warfare. It was an embodiment of Viking culture. It represented their connection to the sea, their belief in the gods, and their desire to leave a lasting legacy. The longship was an integral part of their identity, and it played a crucial role in their ability to conquer new lands, establish trade routes, and build a civilization that would leave an indelible mark on history. As we look at the legacy of Viking shipbuilding today, we see that their ships remain one of the most enduring symbols of Viking culture. Viking longships are still admired for their beauty, craftsmanship, and engineering, and they continue to inspire modern shipbuilders. The techniques used by Viking shipbuilders, including clinker building and steam bending, have influenced shipbuilding practices throughout history, and their ships remain an icon of Viking ingenuity. In museums around the world, Viking longships are on display as symbols of the Vikings' extraordinary achievements. These ships serve as a testament to the skill and determination of the Viking people, who were able to master the art of shipbuilding to create vessels that could navigate the roughest seas, conquer distant lands, and connect disparate cultures. The Viking longship is a lasting symbol of the Viking spirit, adaptable, resourceful, and always reaching for the horizon. As we continue our journey into the forgotten art of Viking shipbuilding, we must now examine how the Viking ships played a pivotal role in their society beyond just military and exploratory ventures. Viking ships were not just tools of conquest or transport, they were central to the social, religious, and economic life of the Norsemen. These ships became integral to the very identity of the Viking people, and they reflected the deeply intertwined relationship between their culture and the sea. To understand the significance of Viking shipbuilding, it's essential to consider how these ships were embedded in the everyday lives of the Vikings, influencing everything from family structure to warfare to religious beliefs. The very construction of a Viking longship began as a communal effort that reflected the importance of teamwork and social cohesion within Viking society. Shipbuilding was a collective enterprise that involved not just the shipwrights and artisans, but entire communities. Men, women, and children all had roles to play in supporting the building of these magnificent vessels. While the shipwrights focused on the complex tasks of shaping the hull, bending the wood, and fitting the planks together, others helped gather resources, transport materials, and provide the labor needed for the construction. It was a group effort that united the Vikings in a shared mission, much like their raids and voyages. Viking ships were also a symbol of familial and tribal pride. The Vikings were organized into small communities, often based around a single clan or family, and each family or clan took great pride in the ships they owned. These ships were not just practical tools, they were a direct reflection of the wealth, status, and power of the clan or family that owned them. The more impressive the ship, the more honor and respect it brought to the family. It was not uncommon for Viking chieftains or kings to commission grand ships adorned with elaborate carvings and figureheads to reflect their wealth and status. This practice also reinforced the idea of the king or chieftain as the head of the community, a leader who could command respect and loyalty from his followers. In the context of warfare, Viking ships were also a symbol of strength and the martial prowess of the Viking people. The ship was not only a tool for invasion but also a symbol of the Viking warrior's identity. A warrior's ship was a reflection of his prowess, and many of the most famous Viking warriors are known to have commanded ships that were both technologically advanced and adorned with remarkable artwork. Viking longships were often painted with bright colors, and their figureheads were designed to strike fear into the hearts of enemies. These ships, with their sleek designs and fearsome ornamentation, became the stuff of legend, cementing the reputation of the Vikings as fierce and unstoppable warriors. Yet, while the Vikings were known for their fearsome raids and invasions, their ships also played a crucial role in the peaceful and economic aspects of Viking society. These ships were essential to the Vikings' vast trade network, which stretched across Europe, Asia, and even North America. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were also traders, bringing goods like furs, iron, amber, and wool to distant lands in exchange for luxury items like spices, silk, and silver. Their longships allowed them to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, making it possible for the Vikings to establish an extensive trading network that connected disparate cultures and civilizations. This network helped spread Viking influence far beyond the reaches of their military conquests. The Vikings were also known for their ability to maintain peaceful relationships with other cultures, and their ships played a significant role in fostering these connections. Through trade, marriage alliances, and diplomatic exchanges, the Vikings were able to establish ties with the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, and even the Byzantine Empire. The Viking longship, with its speed and agility, made it easy for the Vikings to move between different territories, facilitating both trade and cultural exchange. The Vikings' ships became symbols of peaceful interaction as much as they were instruments of war. In addition to trade and diplomacy, Viking ships were also integral to the Vikings' religious and spiritual practices. The connection between the Viking people and the sea was not just practical, it was spiritual. The Vikings believed that the sea was a divine force, and their ships were seen as vessels that carried them to the gods. When a Viking warrior died, it was common for his ship to be part of his burial ritual. In some cases, the deceased would be buried in a ship, with his possessions and even slaves placed alongside him, ready to accompany him on his journey to the afterlife. These ship burials were seen as a way to honor the deceased and ensure their safe passage to the halls of Valhalla, the Viking afterlife. The figureheads of Viking ships were also imbued with spiritual significance. These carvings, which often depicted animals like dragons, serpents, and wolves, were believed to provide protection and guidance to the ship and its crew. The figureheads were thought to have magical powers that could ward off evil spirits and ensure a successful voyage. The process of creating these figureheads was a sacred task, and many shipbuilders would call upon the gods for guidance before beginning the carving process. In this way, Viking ships were not just tools of war and trade, they were also instruments of divine will, carrying the hopes and prayers of the Vikings with them as they sailed into the unknown. In examining the role of Viking ships in the spiritual life of the Vikings, we see how deeply intertwined the Vikings were with their maritime environment. The sea was not just a physical realm for the Vikings, it was a spiritual realm as well. The Viking ships were not only practical vehicles, they were symbols of the Viking people's connection to the divine, to the natural world, and to the afterlife. Through these ships, the Vikings were able to navigate both the physical world and the spiritual realm, forging a path between the living and the dead. As we continue to explore the forgotten art of Viking shipbuilding, it becomes clear that the Viking longship was more than just a marvel of engineering. It was a symbol of Viking identity, spirituality, and culture. The ships carried the hopes, dreams, and ambitions of the Viking people, and their craftsmanship continues to inspire awe and admiration to this day. Now that we've explored the multifaceted role of Viking ships in society, we can delve deeper into the actual construction process, the intricate techniques and materials that made the Viking longship a true marvel of ancient engineering. The Vikings were master shipbuilders, and their ability to create vessels that could withstand the harshest seas and navigate the most challenging waterways was nothing short of extraordinary. The skills passed down through generations of shipbuilders were honed over centuries, and the result was a ship design that combined functionality, speed, and durability. The building of a Viking longship was no small task. It began with a careful selection of materials, Oak was the primary wood used for the ship's frame, as it was strong and flexible enough to endure the stresses of the sea. The Vikings sourced their timber from local forests, and the process of felling the trees and preparing the wood was a meticulous one. The trees were cut with axes, and the logs were stripped of their bark before being shaped into planks. These planks were then carefully steamed to make them pliable and able to bend around the ship's frame. The construction process itself was a communal effort, involving many hands. It began with the building of the keel, the backbone of the ship, upon which the rest of the structure would be built. The keel was typically made from a single piece of wood, which was carefully shaped and fitted to the other components. From there, the ribs of the ship were added, creating the skeleton that would support the rest of the vessel. Once the frame was completed, the planks were attached, overlapping like the shingles on a roof, to create the ship's hull. The Vikings didn't just focus on the practicality of their ships, they also paid great attention to the aesthetics of their vessels. This is where the true artistry of Viking shipbuilding came into play. The shipbuilders would carve intricate designs into the wooden planks, often depicting animals, gods, and other symbolic motifs. These carvings weren't just decorative, they were believed to hold spiritual significance, providing protection and favor from the gods. The figureheads, in particular, were highly detailed and often depicted fierce animals like dragons, serpents, and wolves, which were believed to ward off evil spirits and bring good fortune to the ship and its crew. The craftsmanship involved in Viking shipbuilding was also reflected in the sails. Unlike the massive sails of modern ships, Viking sails were typically made from wool and were smaller in size, which allowed for greater maneuverability and speed. These sails were often brightly colored, with patterns that would make the ships easy to spot on the water. The Viking sail was an essential part of the ship's design, allowing it to harness the power of the wind and navigate across vast distances. The combination of the strong oak frame, flexible wooden planks, and efficient sail design made the Viking longship an incredibly versatile vessel, able to traverse the open sea, navigate rivers, and even land on beaches for raids. Historians still argue about the exact methods used to build these ships, whether the Vikings used iron nails to fasten the planks together, or if they used a more primitive method of binding them with rope or leather. Some scholars believe that the Vikings used rivets made of iron to attach the planks, while others argue that they employed a technique known as clinker building, where the planks were overlapped and bound together with iron or wooden pegs. Either way, the result was a ship that was both sturdy and lightweight, allowing it to withstand the rigors of the sea while maintaining speed and agility. The final step in the shipbuilding process was the addition of the oars. Viking ships were often equipped with as many as 30 or 40 oars, depending on the size of the vessel. These oars were made of wood and were designed to be both strong and flexible. The oarsmen, who were typically slaves or hired laborers, would row in unison, propelling the ship forward at great speed. The ability to row the ship allowed the Vikings to navigate narrow rivers and channels that would have been inaccessible to larger, more cumbersome ships. It also made the longships highly effective in raids, as they could approach shore quickly and quietly, allowing the Vikings to surprise their enemies. Once completed, the Viking longship was a thing of beauty and power, sleek, fast, and capable of carrying its crew across vast distances with ease. The ship became the symbol of Viking strength and ingenuity, and it played a key role in the Vikings' dominance over the seas and their ability to expand their empire across Europe and beyond. The ships were also a reflection of the Viking worldview, their connection to the sea, their belief in the gods, and their constant pursuit of adventure and conquest. In addition to their practical uses, Viking ships were also symbols of status and power. A Viking chieftain's longship was often larger and more elaborate than those of his warriors, and it was adorned with beautiful carvings and decorations that reflected his wealth and prestige. The ship was a reflection of the chieftain's ability to lead and protect his people, and it was a symbol of his connection to the gods. Even in death, the Viking chieftain's ship would remain a powerful symbol, with many being buried in or alongside their ships as a final resting place. As we move forward in this exploration of Viking shipbuilding, we can see how the ships were not just tools of war or exploration. They were an integral part of Viking culture, reflecting the values and beliefs of the Viking people. From the materials used to build the ships to the intricate carvings and decorations, Viking ships were works of art and engineering that combined beauty with functionality. They were a testament to the ingenuity and skill of the Vikings, and their legacy continues to inspire awe and admiration to this day. Now that we've examined the shipbuilding process and the physicality behind these incredible vessels, let's shift our focus to the role these ships played in Viking society and their legacy in the broader world. Viking longships were not just tools for war and exploration. They were central to the Vikings' way of life. their identity, and their culture, these ships were a symbol of the Viking ethos, a mix of strength, adventure, and resilience. Their ability to travel across vast distances made them a crucial part of the Viking expansion into new lands. And their legacy lives on in the influence they had on the world around them. The Viking longship was an essential part of the Vikings' ability to raid, trade, and colonize. These ships allowed them to travel quickly and efficiently over long distances, whether it was to raid the coasts of Britain and France, trade with the Byzantines and Arabs, or establish settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. The ships were designed for versatility, able to navigate the open sea, rivers, and even shallow waters close to the shore. This made the Vikings particularly effective in their raids and conquests, as they could strike quickly, land unexpectedly, and retreat just as fast. One of the most remarkable aspects of Viking longships was their ability to sail into rivers. These ships were highly maneuverable, able to navigate the narrowest of waterways, allowing the Vikings to strike deep into enemy territories. Unlike larger ships that were designed for ocean travel, the Viking longship could be used in rivers, lakes, and estuaries, giving the Vikings a strategic advantage over their enemies. This allowed them to launch surprise attacks on cities and towns, even those far inland, and to retreat before their enemies could mount a proper defense. The role of the Viking longship in exploration is perhaps most famously seen in the voyages of Leif Erikson, who is credited with discovering North America, specifically the land he called Vinland, which is thought to be located in modern-day Newfoundland. The ship Erikson sailed in, the longship, would have been one of the very vessels we've been discussing. The ability to travel across the open sea, with its unpredictable weather and vast distances, was a remarkable feat of engineering for the time. It's not just that these ships were functional, they were advanced for their era, allowing the Vikings to reach far-flung lands across the North Atlantic and establish one of the earliest known European presences in the Americas. Historians continue to debate how far Viking exploration extended, with some suggesting that the Vikings reached as far as the Mediterranean and North Africa, trading with and even raiding distant lands. The speed and versatility of their ships made these voyages possible, and the Vikings' ability to adapt to various environments gave them an edge over other seafaring cultures of the time. Their longships were more than just a means of transportation. They were a tool for empire building, allowing the Vikings to carve out territories far from their homeland. Yet, despite their dominance at sea, the Viking longship also played a significant role in Viking funerary practices. The Vikings believed that death was just another journey, one that required the same preparation and care as a voyage to new lands. It was not uncommon for a Viking chieftain or warrior to be buried with his ship, either as a burial ship or in a ship-shaped mound. These burial practices were symbolic of the belief that the deceased would sail to the afterlife, continuing their adventures in the world beyond. The burial ship often contained grave goods, such as weapons, jewelry, and other treasures, all of which were believed to help the deceased in the afterlife. The ship itself was a symbol of the journey, of the Vikings' connection to the sea, and of their belief in the eternal adventure that awaited them after death. Some of the most famous Viking burial sites, like those found in Oseberg, Norway, contain elaborate ships that were once used in life, now repurposed to carry the soul to the next realm. The Vikings' relationship with their ships was so deep that even in death, the ships continued to serve as vessels for exploration. Despite their undeniable importance, the Viking longship fell out of use over time. As the Viking Age came to an end and the political landscape of Europe shifted, the longship was eventually replaced by larger, more heavily armed ships designed for new kinds of warfare. The development of larger vessels capable of carrying more troops and heavy artillery marked the end of the Viking Age. But the legacy of the longship lived on in the ships of future centuries. Historians still argue about the true impact of the Viking longship. Some see it as a symbol of Viking power and conquest, while others view it as a reflection of the Vikings' deep connection to the sea and their desire for adventure. Regardless of the interpretation, it's clear that the Viking longship played an integral role in shaping the history of Northern Europe and beyond. The ships may have eventually disappeared from the seas, but their influence remains. Their design, craftsmanship, and versatility paved the way for future advancements in shipbuilding. From the age of exploration to the rise of modern naval warfare, the Viking longship's impact is felt to this day. The Viking ship, with its elegant curves, intricate carvings, and remarkable functionality, was a true marvel of ancient engineering, one that allowed a small group of seafarers to conquer vast stretches of the world. As we reflect on the Viking longship, we see not just a vessel, but a symbol of the adventurous spirit that has driven humans throughout history. It was a tool for survival, a means of exploration, and a key to the expansion of a culture that left an indelible mark on the world. And while the ships may no longer sail the seas, their legacy endures, reminding us of the ingenuity, determination, and resilience that has always been a part of the human spirit. As we come to the final section of our journey through the fascinating history of Viking shipbuilding, let's take a moment to consider the broader implications of the longship's design, its role in Viking society, and its lasting legacy in the world of maritime history. From its roots in the shipyards of Scandinavia to its impact on modern naval engineering, the Viking longship was more than just a vessel. It was a symbol of innovation, culture, and the relentless pursuit of adventure. The design of the Viking longship, with its sleek lines, shallow draft, and flexible construction, was a direct response to the unique demands placed on the Vikings as seafarers. Unlike the larger, heavier ships of other cultures, the longship was designed for speed, agility, and versatility. Its ability to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers made it a formidable tool for the Vikings' raids. But it also allowed them to establish trade routes, transport settlers, and explore new lands. It was a ship that could travel across vast expanses of water and then slip silently into a river or estuary, making it ideal for both military and civilian purposes. Historians still debate the exact origins of the longship. While the general consensus is that it evolved from earlier Norse boat designs, the true nature of its development remains a topic of scholarly discussion. Some believe that the longship was a product of Viking ingenuity, created in response to the specific needs of the Viking Age, while others argue that its design was influenced by earlier Mediterranean or Celtic shipbuilding techniques. What is clear, however, is that the longship was a major technological advancement, enabling the Vikings to extend their reach across vast distances and establish one of the most formidable naval forces of the medieval world. Beyond its functionality, the Viking longship also played an important role in Viking culture and identity. For the Vikings, the sea was not just a means of transportation, it was central to their way of life. The longship was a symbol of their connection to the natural world, to their ancestors, and to their gods. It was said that a Viking ship could carry the soul of a warrior to the afterlife, with the ship itself acting as a bridge between the mortal realm and the divine. This belief in the sacredness of the ship can be seen in the elaborate burial practices of the Vikings, where kings and warriors were sometimes interred in ship-shaped graves, their ships serving as both a final resting place and a means of spiritual passage. While the Viking longship may have fallen out of use with the decline of Viking power, its legacy continues to influence modern shipbuilding. Many aspects of the longship's design, such as its use of a flexible, clinker-built hull, are still employed in modern boat construction. The longship's influence can also be seen in the development of later naval vessels. From the longboats of the medieval period to the sleek destroyers and submarines of today, the principles of speed, agility, and versatility that were central to the longship's design continue to inform the design of modern military and recreational boats. The longship also left a cultural mark that has lasted through the centuries. Its role in the Viking Age, and in the spread of Viking culture throughout Europe and beyond, is still celebrated in modern times. From the Viking reenactments at festivals to the resurgence of interest in Viking history and heritage, the longship remains a symbol of the Viking spirit of exploration and conquest. It is a reminder of a time when the seas were a vast, untamed frontier, and the Viking longship was the key to navigating it. As we wrap up our exploration of the Viking longship, it's important to remember that the legacy of these ships is not just about their design or their role in history. The longship was a reflection of the Vikings themselves, innovative, daring, and fiercely determined. These ships were more than just vessels. They were the embodiment of the Viking spirit. And even though the Vikings may have disappeared from the world stage, their longships continue to sail through history, reminding us of the incredible achievements of a people who were ahead of their time. So, as you lay down to sleep tonight, imagine the sound of waves gently lapping against the hull of a Viking longship, its sails billowing in the wind as it glides across the sea. The distant shore is just beyond sight, but the ship's course is set, its journey continuing through the ages. The Viking longship may no longer sail the seas, but its legacy endures, carried forward by the stories of the brave seafarers who once called it home.